In the soft hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between sleeping and waking, there exists a threshold, a liminal space where truth whispers its most sacred secrets. You know this place, though you may not remember its name. It is the space between what you have become and what you truly are, between the life you are living and the life that lives within you, waiting. There is a great numbing that has descended upon our time like winter fog rolling across a vast landscape, settling into every valley of the human heart. You feel it, don't you? This strange suspension between feeling too much and feeling nothing at all. It is not the clean pain of a broken bone or the sharp grief of loss. Those honest sufferings that demand attention and healing. No, this is something far more subtle and infinitely more profound, the soul's protective retreat into a chrysalis of numbness, a sacred cocoon spun from the threads of overwhelm and the silk of survival. Carl Jung, that cartographer of the psyche's hidden territories, recognized this paradox as one of the most sacred wounds on the path to individuation. He saw that in our modern world, consciousness itself had become a burden almost too great to bear. The sheer velocity of change, the constant bombardment of information, the relentless demands for productivity and performance, all of this creates a kind of existential whiplash that sends the soul scrambling for shelter. And so you find yourself here in this strange twilight state of being both witness and prisoner to your own life. You watch yourself move through your days like a sleepwalker in a vivid dream, aware of the emptiness yet somehow unable to feel its weight. You see the disconnection from others, from nature, from the deep currents of meaning that once moved through your life like underground rivers, and yet you observe it all through a peculiar kind of protective glass, as if you were viewing your own existence from behind museum display. This is not depression as the world understands it, though it may masquerade as such. Depression implies a pressing down, a weight that crushes. But what you experience is more like a lifting away, a strange levitation of the soul that floats just above the surface of life, never quite touching down, never quite taking flight. It is the psyche's brilliant adaptation to a world that has become too much to feel fully and too little to satisfy completely. Jung understood that the modern human being exists in a state of unprecedented psychological pressure. Never before, in human history, have we been asked to process so much information, to adapt to such rapid change, to maintain our humanity in the face of such mechanical demands. The ancient rhythms that once governed human life, the cycles of seasons, the patterns of community, the slow unfolding of wisdom through lived experience, have been shattered and scattered like seeds on barren ground. In response, something deep within you has made a profound choice. Like a creature sensing the approach of winter, your soul has begun the process of cocoon building, wrapping itself in layers of protective numbness. This is not weakness, it is wisdom. This is not failure. It is a form of genius that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, orchestrating your psychological survival with the same intelligence that guides a caterpillar into its chrysalis. But here is what the world does not understand, what even you may not yet recognize. This numbing, this protective retreat, is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your most sacred transformation. The chrysalis is never meant to be a permanent dwelling. It is a temporary sanctuary where the deepest alchemy of the soul takes place. Within its dark silence, something profound is stirring. Not the death of who you are, but the dissolution of who you have been pretending to be. Jung called this process Enantiodromia, the principle by which everything eventually turns into its opposite. The very numbness that seems to separate you from life is paradoxically preparing you for a more authentic engagement with existence. The emptiness you feel is not the absence of meaning, but the clearing away of false meanings, making space for something more genuine to emerge. Think of the caterpillar in its chrysalis. From the outside, it appears that nothing is happening, just a still, seemingly lifeless pod hanging from a branch. But within that darkness, one of nature's most extraordinary transformations is taking place. The caterpillar's entire physical structure dissolves into what scientists call imaginal soup, a primordial liquid from which the butterfly will eventually emerge. The old form must completely let go before the new form can take shape. This is what is happening within you, though you may not recognize it. The comfortable structures of your former self, the beliefs about who you are, the strategies you've used to navigate the world, the very foundations of your identity, are beginning to dissolve. This dissolution feels like dying because in a very real sense it is. But it is not the death that ends. It is the death that transforms. You have been living, perhaps for years, in a state of what Jung termed provisional life, existing as if your real life were always about to begin, as if you were constantly preparing for something that never quite arrives. This provisional existence is characterized by a peculiar quality of unreality, a sense that you are always slightly removed from your own experience, watching it unfold from a safe distance rather than diving fully into its depths. The modern world encourages this provisional way of being. It tells you that happiness lies in the next achievement, the next relationship, the next purchase, the next destination. It keeps you perpetually oriented toward a future that recedes like a mirage as you approach it, preventing you from ever settling fully into the present moment where your actual life is taking place. And so you have learned to live in the shallows, skimming across the surface of experience like a stone across water. You engage just enough to function, feel just enough to survive, hope just enough to keep moving forward. But the deeper currents, those underground rivers of meaning, passion, and authentic connection, remain largely untapped, their power flowing beneath your awareness like buried streams. This surface existence, this skimming across the top of life, creates a particular kind of suffering that is difficult to name or treat. It is not the acute pain that drives people to seek immediate help, but rather a chronic ache, a background hum of dissatisfaction that colors every experience with a subtle gray tint. You may function perfectly well by external standards, maintaining relationships, pursuing career goals, engaging in social activities, while internally feeling like you are watching someone else live your life. Jung recognized that this disconnection from our deeper selves is not merely a personal problem but a collective one. We live in what he called an unconscious age, a time when the rapid pace of technological and social change has outstripped our psychological capacity to integrate these changes meaningfully. We have gained tremendous power to manipulate our external environment while losing touch with our inner landscape, creating a dangerous imbalance that manifests as both individual neurosis and collective crisis. The symptoms of this imbalance are everywhere. The epidemic of anxiety and depression, the rise of addiction and compulsive behaviors, the breakdown of traditional communities and meaning-making structures, the widespread sense of isolation despite unprecedented technological connection. These are not separate problems, but different facets of the same underlying crisis, the soul's exile from its own depths. In this exile, you have become like a refugee in your own life, carrying with you the persistent sense that you belong somewhere else, that there is some other version of existence where you would feel truly at home. This feeling of displacement is not neurotic, it is accurate. You do belong somewhere else. Not in a different geographical location or life circumstance, but in a different relationship with yourself and reality. The chrysalis of numbness that has formed around you is your psyche's response to this displacement. Unable to return to the innocence of unconscious living, yet not yet ready for the full responsibilities of conscious existence, you find yourself suspended between worlds. This suspension is uncomfortable, even painful, but it is also necessary. You are in the liminal space, the threshold between one way of being and another. Jung understood that all genuine transformation requires this passage through the liminal space, this time of being neither fully what you were nor yet what you are becoming. He called it holding the tension of the opposites, the psychological capacity to remain present to contradictory truths without rushing to resolve them prematurely. In your case, the opposites might be feeling a numbness, connection and isolation, meaning and emptiness, hope and despair. The tendency of the ego is to try to escape this tension as quickly as possible, to choose one side or the other rather than endure the uncomfortable uncertainty of the middle space. You might try to push through the numbness with forced enthusiasm, or alternatively, you might surrender completely to the emptiness and declare all of life meaningless. Both of these responses, while understandable, short-circuit the transformative process that is trying to unfold. The wisdom of the chrysalis lies in its patience, its willingness to remain in the darkness and uncertainty for as long as the transformation requires. The caterpillar cannot will itself into becoming a butterfly. It can only surrender to the process and trust that the intelligence that guides metamorphosis knows what it is doing. Similarly, you cannot force your way out of this protective numbness through sheer effort or positive thinking. You can only learn to inhabit it more consciously, to recognize it as a sacred space rather than a prison. This shift in perspective, from viewing your numbness as pathology to recognizing it as cocoon, changes everything. Suddenly, the very experiences that seem to signal your failure or breakdown reveal themselves as signs of a deeper wisdom at work. The exhaustion that makes you want to withdraw from social obligations is not weakness, but your psyche's insistence on conservation of energy for the inner work that needs to happen. The inability to feel passionate about pursuits that once excited you is not depression, but a clearing away of false enthusiasms, making space for more authentic interest to emerge. The sense of watching your life from a distance is not dissociation, but the first stirring of a deeper witnessing consciousness, the self observing the ego's drama with compassionate detachment. This witnessing awareness is one of the most precious gifts of the chrysalis experience, though it may feel more like a curse when you first encounter it. To see yourself so clearly, to observe your patterns and defenses with such stark honesty, can be deeply humbling and sometimes painful, but this witnessing is also liberating. As you learn to observe your life from this slightly removed perspective, you begin to see that you are not identical to your thoughts, emotions, or circumstances. There is something within you that remains constant through all the changes. A center of awareness that watches without judgment, a core of being that exists independent of the various roles and identities you have accumulated. Jung called this unchanging center the self, not the small self of ego consciousness, but the larger self that encompasses both conscious and unconscious elements of your psyche. The self is like the sun around which all the planets of your personality orbit. When you are in touch with this center, even the most challenging experiences carry a quality of meaning and purpose. When you are disconnected from it, even pleasant experiences feel hollow and unsatisfying. The chrysalis experience is ultimately about remembering this center, about returning to a relationship with the self that has been obscured by the demands and distractions of modern life. But this return cannot be forced or rushed. Like all genuine spiritual work, it requires what Jung called active imagination, the ability to engage with the images and symbols that arise from your unconscious with both openness and discernment. Your dreams during this time may become more vivid and meaningful, carrying messages from depths of your psyche that have been long silent. Pay attention to them. The stories and myths that capture your imagination, the music that moves you to tears, the moments in nature when you feel briefly connected to something larger than yourself. These are all threads leading you back to your own center. There may be days when the numbness lifts slightly, when you catch glimpses of the person you are becoming, These moments can be both exhilarating and frightening, like brief flashes of sunlight through storm clouds. You might find yourself crying, for the first time in months, or laughing with a depth of joy you had forgotten was possible. You might feel a sudden surge of creative energy, or experience a moment of profound peace in the midst of chaos. These glimpses are precious, but do not mistake them for the end of your transformation. They are more like lightning illuminating a landscape at night, brief revelations of what lies ahead, but not yet the steady daylight of integrated consciousness. The work of the chrysalis is patient work, requiring you to return again and again to the darkness, trusting that each descent takes you deeper into your own truth. Jung learned this patience through his own dark night of the soul, his confrontation with the unconscious that lasted nearly 2 decades. During this time, he experienced visions, dialogued with inner figures, and gradually developed the theoretical framework that would become depth psychology. But this was not merely an intellectual exercise, it was a lived initiation into the mysteries of human transformation. Like Jung, you are being initiated into your own depths. The numbness you experience is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Within its protective embrace, the most essential parts of yourself are being preserved and transformed. The false self, constructed from external expectations and survival strategies, is being gently dissolved, making way for the emergence of your authentic nature. This process cannot be hurried, but it can be honored. You can learn to work with your chrysalis rather than against it, recognizing it as the sacred vessel within which your deepest transformation is taking place. This might mean spending more time alone, reducing your social obligations to what feels truly nourishing, allowing yourself to not know what comes next rather than forcing premature clarity. It might mean developing a different relationship with productivity, recognizing that the most important work you are doing right now is largely invisible and cannot be measured by conventional standards. The culture around you may not understand this, may pressure you to get back to normal or snap out of it. But you must learn to trust your own timing, your own process. The chrysalis protects what is most precious in you while it undergoes its mysterious transformation. To emerge too early is to risk never becoming who you truly are. But to remain too long in the protective numbness is to miss the moment when the butterfly is ready to unfold its wings. Learning to recognize this moment when protection becomes prison, when the chrysalis shifts from sanctuary to confinement, is part of the art of conscious transformation. It requires developing an intimate relationship with your inner landscape, learning to read the subtle signals that indicate readiness for the next phase of your journey. For now, it is enough to know that you are exactly where you need to be. The numbness that surrounds you is not your enemy, but your protector. Not your failure, but your wisdom. Within its gentle embrace, the deepest alchemy of the soul is taking place. Trust the process. Honor the mystery. Allow the transformation to unfold in its own perfect timing. The butterfly dreams within the chrysalis, and you are that dream becoming real. In the autumn of 1913, Carl Gustav Jung stood at the edge of his own abyss and made a choice that would forever change the landscape of human understanding. At 38 years old, at the height of his professional success as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, he felt the ground beneath his carefully constructed life begin to tremble and crack. The break with Freud had left him intellectually orphaned, professionally isolated, and spiritually adrift. But more than that, something ancient and archetypal was stirring in the depths of his psyche, demanding his attention with the inexorable force of an underground river finally breaking through to the surface. What happened next was not mental. Illness as the world understands it, though it would appear so to any observer trained in the pathology of the mind. Jung was about to embark on a journey that would take him 17 years to complete, a descent into the underworld of his own unconscious that would shatter every assumption he had about the nature of human consciousness and rebuild him as something entirely new. This was not breakdown, but breakthrough, not psychosis, but initiation into the most sacred mysteries of the human soul. Jung called it his confrontation with the unconscious. But even this clinical language cannot capture the mythic dimensions of what he experienced. He was living out the ancient pattern of the wounded healer, the shaman who must die to his ordinary consciousness before he can guide others through their own transformations. Every culture has known this archetype, the one who descends into darkness and returns bearing gifts of wisdom for the community. Chiron, who was wounded by his own arrow and became the teacher of healers. Odin, hanging for 9 days on the world tree to gain the knowledge of the runes. Christ in his tomb. Inanna in the underworld. Persephone in her seasonal death and rebirth. But Jung was not merely reenacting these ancient stories. He was discovering their psychological reality, their literal truth as patterns that live within the architecture of every human soul. He was about to become the first person in history to map the territories of the unconscious with the precision of a cartographer and the wisdom of a mystic. But first, he had to surrender everything he thought he knew about the mind and allow himself to be taught by forces that operated far beyond the reach of rational understanding. The descent began with visions. At first, they came as fleeting images during his waking hours, blood-red skies, flooding rivers, frozen landscapes stretching to infinity. These were not the random hallucinations of a disturbed mind, but symbols emerging from the deepest layers of the psyche, carrying messages in the ancient language of myth and metaphor. Jung, trained as a scientist, initially tried to analyze these visions to fit them into his existing theoretical framework. But the images refused to be contained by rational explanation. They demanded something more, not analysis, but participation, not understanding, but surrender. And so Jung made the decision that would define the rest of his life and work. He decided to enter into dialogue with his unconscious, to treat these visions not as symptoms to be eliminated, but as communications from an intelligence far older and wiser than his conscious mind. This was an act of extraordinary courage, for he was stepping into territory that no Western scientist had ever dared to explore with such systematic attention. He was about to discover that the unconscious was not simply a repository of repressed memories and primitive impulses, as Freud had suggested, but a living realm populated by autonomous beings who possessed their own agenda for his psychological and spiritual development. The first of these beings to reveal herself was his anima, the feminine aspect of his psyche that he came to call Salome. She appeared to him initially as a mysterious woman emerging from a cave, accompanied by an old man named Elijah, who represented the wise aspect of his unconscious. These were not mere projections of his conscious mind, but archetypal figures that seemed to possess independent existence, their own personalities, their own wisdom to impart. Through active imagination, a technique he developed to facilitate conscious dialogue with unconscious contents, Jung began to descend regularly into an inner landscape as vivid and detailed as any external geography. He found himself in underground chambers, walking through medieval streets, climbing towers that reached toward impossible heights. In these inner journeys, he encountered beings who challenged his assumptions, taught him forgotten truths, and initiated him into mysteries that he would spend the rest of his life translating into language that others could understand. One of the most profound of these encounters was with a figure he came to call Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher who became Jung's primary inner teacher. Philemon was not a product of Jung's imagination in any conventional sense. He possessed knowledge that Jung did not consciously possess, offered perspectives that challenged Jung's existing beliefs, and demonstrated a wisdom that seemed to emerge from sources far beyond personal experience. Through conversations with Philemon, Jung began to understand that the psyche contained not only personal unconscious material, but also collective layers that connected him to the entire history of human consciousness. This discovery of what he would later term the collective unconscious was perhaps Jung's greatest contribution to human understanding, but it came at an enormous personal cost. To access these deeper layers of the psyche, he had to allow his ego, his sense of personal identity and control, to dissolve repeatedly. He experienced periods of such profound disorientation that he questioned his own sanity, moments when the boundary between inner and outer reality became so permeable that he could barely function in ordinary life. His family watched with concern as he withdrew increasingly from social obligations, spending hours in his study engaged in what appeared to be elaborate conversations with invisible companions. He filled notebook after notebook with detailed records of his inner experiences, creating mandalas and paintings to capture images that defied verbal description. To any external observer, Jung appeared to be losing his grip on reality, but he was actually learning to navigate realms of consciousness that most people never even know exist. The crucial insight that sustained him through this ordeal was his recognition that he was not going insane, but undergoing initiation. The patterns he was experiencing, the dissolution of ordinary identity, the encounter with archetypal figures, the journey through underworld landscapes, matched precisely the structure of initiatory experiences described in mythologies around the world. He was living out the hero's journey, not as literary metaphor, but as psychological fact, discovering that these ancient stories were actually maps of consciousness, guidance systems for navigating the territories of transformation. During his deepest descent, Jung encountered what he came to call his shadow, the rejected, denied, and undeveloped aspects of his personality. This was not simply meeting his dark side in a moralistic sense, but coming face to face with everything he had sacrificed in order to maintain his persona as a respectable Swiss psychiatrist. He found rage he had never allowed himself to feel, creativity he had suppressed in favor of academic respectability, primitive instincts that civilized life had taught him to deny. The shadow appeared to him initially as a dark figure he named the Red One, a primitive man who represented everything Jung's conscious personality had rejected. Instead of fleeing from this figure or trying to eliminate him, Jung learned to engage with him directly, to understand what this rejected part of himself needed and wanted. Through this dialogue, he discovered that the shadow contained not only destructive impulses, but also tremendous vitality and creativity that had been cut off from his conscious life. This integration of shadow material was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Jung's journey, for it required him to expand his identity to include aspects of himself that he found disturbing or unacceptable. He had to learn to hold the tension between his civilized persona and his primitive instincts, between his rational mind and his emotional depths, between his desire for spiritual transcendence and his need for earthy, embodied experience. Jung learned to navigate these inner territories with greater skill and confidence. He began to recognize that his journey was not merely personal, but archetypal. He was living out a pattern that every human being must eventually confront if they wish to achieve psychological wholeness. The specific content of each person's confrontation with the unconscious would be unique, but the underlying structure would remain constant. The call to adventure, the descent into darkness, the encounter with archetypal figures, the integration of rejected aspects of the personality, and finally, the return to ordinary life bearing gifts of wisdom for the Geese community. This recognition transformed Jung's understanding of his own suffering. What had initially felt like personal pathology revealed itself to be a sacred calling, a summons to become a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms. His breakdown was actually breakthrough, not only for himself, but for all of humanity. through his willingness to descend into his own depths and map the territories he discovered there. He was creating a new understanding of human consciousness that would help others navigate their own transformative journeys. The wounded healer archetype that Jung was embodying carries within it a profound paradox. The healer must first be wounded in order to develop the compassion and wisdom necessary to help others. The wound becomes the source of healing power, not despite the pain it caused, but because of it. Jung's psychological crisis gave him access to realms of experience that would have remained forever closed to him had he maintained his comfortable professional identity. His suffering became his qualification to guide others through their own dark nights of the soul. This pattern of necessary wounding appears throughout human history in the stories of great spiritual teachers and healers. The Buddha's encounter with old age, sickness, and death shattered his protected palace existence and launched him on the path to enlightenment. Jesus' crucifixion became the foundation of his power to resurrect not only himself but others. The shaman's initiatory illness, often involving a symbolic death and dismemberment, prepares them to journey between worlds and bring back healing for their community. Jung's particular wound was the splitting apart of his rational, scientific worldview to make room for direct experience of the numinous, those encounters with the sacred that carry undeniable emotional and spiritual impact but cannot be reduced to rational explanation. As a man trained in the empirical methods of medicine and psychology, Jung had to find a way to honor both his scientific integrity and his mystical experiences. This required developing what he called a transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposite truths in creative tension without being torn apart by their contradiction. Through his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung discovered that the psyche operates according to principles that are both rational and transrational, that consciousness and unconsciousness exist in a constant dialogue that shapes every aspect of human experience. He learned that symptoms and suffering often carry messages from parts of the psyche that have been neglected or rejected, and that healing involves not simply eliminating symptoms, but understanding and integrating the wisdom they contain. This understanding revolutionized his approach to therapy. Instead of viewing his patients' psychological disturbances as pathologies to be cured, he began to see them as communications from the unconscious, invitations to embark on their own journeys of self-discovery. He developed active imagination as a therapeutic technique, teaching his patients to dialogue with their dream figures, to explore their inner landscapes, to develop relationships with the archetypal aspects of their own psyches. The Red Book, Jung's record of his visionary experiences, remained unpublished during his lifetime because he understood that it represented such a radical departure from conventional psychology that it might undermine the credibility of his other work. But this collection of paintings, dialogues, and reflections stands as one of the most profound documents of psychological and spiritual transformation ever created. In its pages, we see a brilliant rational mind learning to accommodate non-rational experience, a successful professional allowing himself to be taught by inner figures that conventional psychology would dismiss as hallucinations. What makes Jung's journey particularly relevant to our contemporary situation is that he undertook it not as a mystic withdrawing from the world, but as a man fully engaged with the intellectual and professional demands of his time. He was not seeking escape from modern life, but trying to find a way to live authentically within it, while remaining connected to the deeper sources of meaning and vitality that modernity tends to obscure. His confrontation with the unconscious taught him that the modern emphasis on rational consciousness, while bringing tremendous technological and scientific advances, had created a dangerous imbalance in the human psyche. By rejecting or ignoring the wisdom of the unconscious, modern people had cut themselves off from sources of guidance and renewal that are essential for psychological health. The result was the kind of spiritual emptiness and existential anxiety that characterizes so much of contemporary life. But Jung also discovered that this crisis contains within it the seeds of its own resolution. The very symptoms that seem to indicate psychological breakdown, the dreams that won't be ignored, the feelings that can't be rationalized away, the persistent sense that something essential is missing from life, are actually attempts by the unconscious to restore balance and wholeness. They are invitations to begin one's own descent into the depths, to encounter the archetypal figures that live within every human psyche, to integrate the rejected aspects of personality that hold the keys to authentic selfhood. The wounded healer's journey is not a path that can be walked once and then completed. It is a recurring cycle of death and rebirth, descent and return, wounding and healing. Each time Jung descended into his unconscious, he discovered new territories to explore, new aspects of himself to integrate, new wisdom to bring back to his work with others. The journey never truly ended. It simply deepened and expanded, revealing ever more subtle layers of psychological and spiritual reality. This is the gift that Jung's wounded healer journey offers to anyone willing to embrace their own transformative potential. The recognition that our deepest wounds, when approached with courage and consciousness, become our greatest sources of wisdom and healing power. The very experiences that seem to threaten our sanity or stability are often the psyche's way of calling us toward a more authentic and integrated way of being. Jung's legacy lies not only in the theoretical framework he developed, but in the lived example he provided of how a modern person can navigate the territories of transformation while remaining grounded in practical reality. He showed us that it is possible to honor both rational consciousness and mystical experience, to be both scientifically rigorous and spiritually open, to heal others by first allowing ourselves to be wounded and then learning to transform that wounding into wisdom. The wounded healer archetype lives within each of us, waiting for the moment when life breaks us open enough to begin our own descent into the depths. When that moment comes, and it comes for everyone who seeks authentic selfhood, Jung's journey serves as both map and companion, showing us that what appears to be breakdown is often the beginning of breakthrough, that what feels like losing ourselves is actually the first step toward finding who we truly are. Look into the mirror this morning and tell me, who is looking back? Is it you? Or is it the carefully constructed image you have spent years perfecting, polishing, and presenting to a world that demands nothing less than flawless performance? The face in the mirror wears the expression you have learned will gain approval, the posture that signals competence, the subtle adjustments of feature and bearing that communicate your place in the complex social hierarchies that govern modern life. But beneath this masterfully crafted surface, something else stirs. Something wild and authentic that you have not seen clearly in so long that you might mistake it for a stranger. Carl Jung called this constructed self the persona, borrowing the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theatre. Like those theatrical masks, the persona serves a vital function. It allows you to play your role in the grand drama of social existence, to communicate your character and intentions to the audience of others who share your stage. But somewhere along the way, the mask became more real to you than your actual face, the role more familiar than your authentic self, the performance more comfortable than the vulnerable truth of who you are when no one is watching. This is not your failure or weakness. It is your adaptation, your survival, your unconscious genius at work. The persona develops as a necessary response to the demands of collective life, allowing you to function smoothly in a world that has little patience for the messy complexity of unfiltered human nature. It is your psychological clothing protecting your tender, authentic self from the harsh winds of judgment, rejection, and social disapproval that would otherwise leave you shivering and exposed. But like all protective mechanisms, the persona carries within it the seeds of its own shadow. What begins as adaptation can calcify into imprisonment, What starts as necessary protection can become suffocating armor that cuts you off not only from others' potential rejection, but also from their genuine love, not only from social judgment, but also from social authenticity, not only from the pain of being truly seen, but also from the ecstasy of being truly known. You have learned to wear your masks so skillfully that you have forgotten your own face beneath them. The professional persona you don for work, with its measured responses and appropriate enthusiasm, its careful balance of competence and deference, its exquisite attunement to the unspoken rules of corporate culture. The social persona you present to friends, with its curated interests and opinions, its practiced wit and charm, its ability to be interesting without being too intense, engaging without being too demanding. The family persona you inhabit during gatherings, playing the role that has been assigned to you since childhood, the responsible one, the fun one, the successful one, the problem one, each mask so perfectly fitted to others' expectations that you barely remember trying it on for the first time. And perhaps most insidious of all, the spiritual persona you have constructed for yourself, the version of you that meditates regularly and speaks in measured, wisdom-tinged tones about acceptance and growth, that posts inspirational quotes and shares insights about consciousness and transformation, that has learned all the right words to describe inner peace, while sometimes feeling like a fraud when that peace remains elusive in the messy reality of daily existence. Each of these personas serves a purpose, fulfills a function, allows you to navigate complex social terrains with a degree of grace and effectiveness. But Jung understood that the danger lies not in having a persona, which is inevitable and necessary, but in identifying with it completely, in forgetting that it is a mask and beginning to believe that it is your true face. When this identification becomes complete, you begin to experience what Jung called persona possession, a psychological state in which you become trapped within your own protective construction, unable to access the deeper currents of authentic selfhood that flow beneath the surface of social performance. The symptoms of persona possession are subtle at first. You might notice that you feel different depending on which social context you're in, as if you become a slightly different person with each group of people you encounter. This chameleon-like adaptability serves you well professionally and socially, but it begins to create an internal fragmentation, a sense that there is no stable center holding all these different versions of yourself together. You might find yourself saying things you don't entirely believe, not out of deception, but because the words fit the persona you're wearing at the moment. The professional you expresses enthusiasm for projects that the authentic you finds meaningless. The social you laughs at jokes that the real you finds cruel or empty. The spiritual you speaks about inner peace, while the actual you churns with anxiety and uncertainty. These are not lies, exactly, but they are not truths either. They are the words of the mask, performing its function of social adaptation, while the genuine self remains hidden backstage. Over time, this split between persona and authentic self begins to create a peculiar form of exhaustion. It takes tremendous energy to maintain multiple masks, to remember which version of yourself you're supposed to be in each situation, to monitor constantly whether your performance is convincing and appropriate. You begin to feel like an actor who has been performing the same roles for so long that you've forgotten what your natural voice sounds like, what your unguarded expressions look like, what your unfiltered thoughts and feelings actually are. Jung recognized that this persona exhaustion is often the first sign that the psyche is ready to begin the work of individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. The very tiredness you feel from maintaining your masks becomes a kind of invitation, a signal from your deeper self that it is time to begin the delicate work of loosening their grip, not to abandon them entirely, but to remember that they are tools rather than identity, performance rather than essence. But this loosening process can feel terrifying, for the persona has become not just your protection but your prison, not just your social strategy but your sense of self. Who would you be without the carefully constructed image that has earned you approval, success, and social belonging? What would people think of you if they saw the unguarded truth of your inner landscape, your doubts, your fears, your primitive impulses, your unfashionable desires, your unspeakable longings? These fears are not irrational. In many social and professional contexts, dropping the persona entirely would indeed be inappropriate and potentially harmful. The art of conscious living lies not in abandoning the persona, but in developing a more conscious relationship with it, learning to wear it lightly rather than being worn by it, using it as a tool for social navigation while maintaining connection to the authentic self that lives beneath its surface. This is where the numbness you have been experiencing begins to reveal its deeper wisdom. That protective fog that has settled over your emotional landscape. That sense of watching your life from a slight distance. These are not signs of depression or dysfunction, but signals that your psyche is preparing for a profound shift in identity. The numbness is your soul's way of withdrawing its energy from the endless performance of persona maintenance, conserving its resources for the deeper work of authentic self-discovery. You have been living what Jung called a provisional life, existing as if your real life were always about to begin, as if you were constantly preparing for some future moment when you would finally be ready to show up authentically. But this future moment keeps receding like a mirage, because the preparation itself has become the prison. You have become so skilled at adapting to others' expectations, so adept at presenting the version of yourself that each situation seems to require, that you have lost touch with what you actually want, what you actually feel, who you actually are beneath all the careful construction. The persona becomes a golden cage, beautiful, admired by others, apparently successful in achieving its aims of social acceptance and professional advancement, but ultimately confining the very essence it was meant to protect. Like a bird that has spent so long in captivity that it no longer remembers how to fly, you may find that the thought of living without the familiar boundaries of your constructed self feels more frightening than liberating. Jung understood that breaking free from persona identification requires what he called moral courage, not the courage to do what is socially acceptable, but the courage to be authentic, even when authenticity might be misunderstood, rejected, or judged. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of psychological development, for it asks you to risk the very thing the persona was constructed to secure: belonging, approval, social acceptance. The process begins with small acts of authenticity, tiny experiments in showing up more genuinely in low-stakes situations. You might share a genuine opinion in a conversation where you would normally just agree with the group consensus. You might express a feeling you would typically keep hidden behind a socially appropriate response. You might admit to not knowing something when the persona would typically pretend expertise. You might say no to a request when the people-pleasing aspect of your persona would automatically say yes. Each of these small acts of authenticity is like removing a thread from the fabric of the persona, not to destroy it, but to loosen its weave, to make it more breathable, more flexible, more conscious. You begin to discover that many of your fears about what would happen if you showed up more authentically are phantoms, projections of your own insecurity rather than accurate predictions of others' responses. But you also discover that some of your relationships were indeed built primarily on persona interactions, and these may begin to feel strained or superficial as you become more genuine. This can be one of the most painful aspects of the individuation process, realizing that some of the connections you thought were meaningful were actually just mutual persona performances, elegant dances of surface interaction that had little to do with who either of you actually are. The grief of this recognition is real and should be honored. You may need to mourn the loss of certain friendships or professional relationships that cannot adapt to your increasing authenticity. You may need to grieve the simpler time when you could maintain your masks without the exhausting awareness that they were masks. You may need to feel the sadness of recognizing how much of your life energy has been spent in service of images rather than in expression of essence. But alongside this grief comes something else, a flickering awareness of who you actually are, beneath all the careful construction. Like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, moments of authentic selfhood begin to pierce through the fog of persona performance. You might find yourself laughing with genuine delight rather than appropriate social mirth. You might feel a surge of creative energy that has nothing to do with others' expectations and everything to do with your soul's desire for expression. You might experience moments of connection with others that feel deeper and more nourishing than anything the persona could manufacture. These glimpses of authenticity are precious, but they can also be disorienting. After years of life lived primarily through the filter of constructed identity, direct experience of your genuine self might feel strange, unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Like eyes adjusting to bright light after long darkness, your consciousness needs time to adapt to the intensity of unfiltered selfhood. Jung recognized that this adjustment period is crucial and should not be rushed. The persona developed over years or decades as a necessary adaptation to your environment, and it cannot be dismantled overnight without causing psychological destabilization. The goal is not to destroy the persona, but to develop what he called persona consciousness, the ability to use your masks skillfully while never losing sight of the fact that they are masks. This consciousness allows you to appreciate the artistry of your own construction while no longer being imprisoned by it. You can admire the skill with which you have learned to navigate complex social situations while remaining rooted in awareness of your authentic desires and values. You can perform your professional role with competence and grace while maintaining inner connection to parts of yourself that have nothing to do with career success. The development of persona consciousness is like learning to be a conscious actor rather than an unconscious one. Instead of being possessed by your roles, you learn to inhabit them with awareness, bringing your authentic presence into each performance while understanding that the performance is not identical to your essence. This creates a kind of creative tension that can actually enhance your effectiveness in the world while preserving your connection to your deeper self. But this process requires patience and self-compassion, for you are essentially learning to live in two worlds simultaneously: the world of social reality with its demands for appropriate performance, and the world of inner authenticity with its hunger for genuine expression. Learning to move fluidly between these worlds without losing yourself in either one is one of the great arts of conscious living. You may find that certain personas are harder to loosen than others. The professional mask might feel more essential because your livelihood depends on it. The family persona might feel more rigid because it has been reinforced by decades of family system dynamics. The spiritual persona might feel more precious because it represents your aspirations for who you want to become. Each persona will require its own careful attention as you learn to wear it more consciously. The ultimate gift of this work is the discovery that authenticity does not mean the absence of adaptation or the abandonment of social grace. True authenticity includes the wisdom to know when adaptation serves not just others' comfort, but your own deeper purposes, when playing a role supports rather than betrays your genuine values and intentions. The difference is consciousness, the awareness that you are choosing to adapt rather than being compulsively driven to perform, that you are using your social skills in service of authentic connection rather than in flight from authentic self-expression. As you learn to inhabit your personas more consciously, you may discover that they actually become more effective, not less. When a mask is worn with awareness rather than desperation, when a role is played with presence rather than anxiety, When a performance emerges from choice rather than compulsion, it often carries a quality of aliveness and authenticity that people can sense even when they cannot name it. This is the paradox of conscious persona work. By becoming more authentic, you often become better at playing roles when roles are called for. By maintaining connection to your genuine self, you actually enhance your ability to connect meaningfully with others, even in contexts that require some degree of persona interaction. The journey from persona possession to persona consciousness is one of the most delicate and rewarding aspects of psychological development. It asks you to maintain the social skills and adaptive capacity that allow you to function effectively in the world while recovering your connection to the wild, authentic, uncontrollable essence that is your birthright. It invites you to become both more skilled at social performance and more rooted in personal authenticity, more effective in the world, and more connected to your soul. This is the liberation that awaits you as you begin to loosen the beautiful prison of the persona. Not the abandonment of all social adaptation, but the recovery of conscious choice about when and how to adapt. The rediscovery of the authentic self that lives beneath all your careful constructions. The remembering of your own face behind all the masks you have learned to wear so well. In the cellar of your consciousness, beneath the floorboards of your acceptable self, lies a treasure chest you've spent a lifetime trying to forget. Here, in this underground cathedral of rejected experience, dwells everything you've banished from the light, your rage that burns like wildfire, your selfishness that clutches and grasps, your primitive desires that howl in the darkness, your creative chaos that threatens to unravel the careful tapestry of who you think you should be. This is your shadow, and it is not your enemy. The numbness you feel, that grey fog that settles over your days like dust on abandoned furniture, often comes from the enormous energy required to keep these rejected aspects of yourself locked away in the basement of your being. Imagine the psychic electricity it takes to maintain this internal prison, to post guards at every door, to ensure that nothing authentic or raw or real can escape to disturb the carefully constructed facade of your persona. You are a warden in the jail of your own soul, and the constant vigilance required to keep your shadow incarcerated has left you exhausted, depleted, numb to the very life force that could set you free. Jung understood what the church and the therapy couch and the self-help industrial complex have forgotten. That integration, not elimination, is the path to wholeness. The shadow isn't a demon to be exorcised, but a lost child to be welcomed home. It isn't evil incarnate, but completeness seeking recognition. It is the part of you that got locked away when you learned that love was conditional, when you discovered that acceptance came with terms and conditions, when you realized that some parts of your natural self were deemed unacceptable by the world that raised you. But what if, and this is the radical proposition that Jung offers like a key to unlock your own prison, what if the very aspects of yourself you've worked so hard to suppress contain the vitality you've been seeking? What if the rage you've buried holds the energy for your authentic voice? What if the selfishness you've denied contains the healthy boundaries you've never learned to set? What if the primitive desires you've shamed hold the key to your deepest creativity and passion? The shadow is not the opposite of light, but its complement, not the enemy of consciousness, but its forgotten twin. In the mythology of alchemy, the prima materia, the base material from which gold is extracted, is often depicted as something dark, crude, rejected. The alchemists knew that transformation doesn't come from starting with something pure, but from working with what has been discarded, despised, pushed aside. They understood that the gold lies hidden in the lead of what we've rejected, that the philosopher's stone emerges not from perfection but from the willingness to work with the raw, unrefined material of our complete humanity. Your shadow formed early, in those first moments when you learned to split yourself in two. the good child who received love and approval, and the bad child who got sent to the internal timeout chair. Perhaps it was your anger that first got banished to the basement, labeled as unacceptable when you discovered that rage made the adults uncomfortable. Perhaps it was your neediness, your vulnerability, your wild creativity, your sexual curiosity, your fierce independence, your desire to question authority. Whatever it was, a part of you learned to hide in order to survive, to go underground in order to keep the love flowing. But survival strategies that serve us at 7 can strangle us at 37. The same psychological mechanisms that protected you as a child, the ability to split off unacceptable parts of yourself and lock them away, become the very source of your adult numbness. You've become so skilled at disowning parts of yourself that you've forgotten they exist, so accomplished at suppression that you've lost touch with the full spectrum of your humanity. The shadow contains not just your so-called negative qualities, but often your greatest gifts, the aspects of yourself that were too bright, too powerful, too threatening for your environment to handle. Perhaps you were told you were too sensitive, so you locked away your gift of emotional attunement. Perhaps you were shamed for being too creative, too dreamy, too different, so you buried your artistic soul in the basement of your consciousness. Perhaps your natural leadership was labeled as bossiness, your intuition dismissed as imagination, your depth criticized as moodiness. The tragedy is not that you have a shadow, everyone does, but that you've forgotten how to dance with it. You've made it your enemy instead of your teacher, your problem instead of your guide into greater wholeness. Jung spoke of the necessity of befriending the shadow, of inviting it not to tea as a metaphor, but as a living practice of internal hospitality. This doesn't mean acting out every shadow impulse, that would be possession, not integration, but rather acknowledging, dialoguing with, and finding healthy expressions for these rejected aspects of yourself. The work of shadow integration is not about becoming your worst self, but about becoming your whole self. It's about recognizing that the rage you've buried might contain the fierce compassion of the warrior protector. The selfishness you've denied might hold the healthy self-care you've never learned to practice. The primitive desires you've shamed might carry the life force that could reanimate your deadened existence. Consider the mythology of the descent into the underworld, a theme that appears in cultures across the globe and throughout time. Inanna descends to meet her dark sister, Ereshkigal. Persephone is pulled into the realm of Hades. Jesus descends into hell before resurrection. These aren't just stories, but maps of psychological transformation, templates for the journey every soul must take to reclaim its wholeness. The descent is not punishment, but initiation, not damnation, but the necessary journey toward integration. Your numbness may be a sign that you're being called into your own underworld descent, invited to meet the parts of yourself you've kept in exile. The shadow calls to you through symptoms, through depression, anxiety, addiction, numbness, rage that seems to come from nowhere, desires that feel foreign to your conscious identity. These are not signs that something is wrong with you, but that something is trying to become conscious, that the basement door is rattling on its hinges, that the prisoners of your own psyche are demanding recognition. The process of shadow work is not a weekend retreat or a quick therapeutic technique, but a lifelong practice of becoming acquainted with your own depths. It requires the courage to look at what you'd rather not see, to feel what you'd rather not feel, to acknowledge what you'd rather not know about yourself. It demands that you develop what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to contain contradictory aspects of yourself without immediately rushing to resolution or judgment. This is where the real work of transformation begins. Not in the light of your conscious ideals, but in the darkness of your rejected reality. Not in who you think you should be, but in who you actually are when all the masks come off. The shadow holds the keys to your vitality because it contains All the life energy you've locked away in service of becoming acceptable, lovable, successful, according to external standards. But the shadow is tricky. It doesn't reveal itself through direct confrontation, but through projection, through finding itself in others. The people who trigger you most intensely, who push your buttons with laser-like precision, are often carrying your shadow for you. The qualities that enrage you in politicians, co-workers, family members, strangers on the internet. These may be mirrors reflecting your own disowned aspects back to you. Jung's revolutionary insight was that we cannot see in others what we do not possess in ourselves. The thief sees thieves everywhere. The liar suspects everyone of lying. The person who has disowned their own aggression becomes surrounded by aggressive people. This is not to say that others are merely projections. They have their own autonomous reality, but that the intensity of your reaction often signals a shadow encounter. When someone's behavior creates a disproportionate response in you, when you find yourself obsessed with someone's flaws, when you feel compelled to fix or change or condemn another person, you may be meeting your own shadow in disguise. The work then becomes not to change the other person, but to reclaim your projection, to own the shadow quality you've been seeing so clearly in others. This is perhaps the most humbling aspect of shadow work, discovering that the very qualities you've criticized most harshly in others live within you as well. The narcissist you condemn may reflect your own unacknowledged self-centeredness. The victim you judge may mirror your own disowned helplessness. The controller you resist may show you your own unrecognized need for power. But here's the profound twist that Jung discovered. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others and begin to own it consciously, something miraculous happens. The energy that was bound up in projection becomes available for your own growth. The rage you were feeling toward others transforms into the fuel for your own authentic expression. The criticism you were directing outward becomes the discernment you need to navigate your own life. The very qualities that seem so toxic in projection become tools for transformation when consciously integrated. This doesn't mean becoming your shadow, but befriending it. There's a crucial difference between shadow possession, being taken over by unconscious contents, and shadow integration, developing a conscious, own face behind all the masks you have learned to wear so well. In the cellar of your consciousness, beneath the floorboards of your acceptable self, lies a treasure chest you've spent a lifetime trying to forget. Here, in this underground cathedral of rejected experience, dwells everything you've banished from the light. Your rage that burns like wildfire, your selfishness that clutches and grasps, your primitive desires that howl in the darkness, your creative chaos that threatens to unravel the careful tapestry of who you think you should be. This is your shadow, and it is not your enemy. The numbness you feel, that grey fog that settles over your days like dust on abandoned furniture, often comes from the enormous energy required to keep these rejected aspects of yourself locked away in the basement of your being. Imagine the psychic electricity it takes to maintain this internal prison, to post guards at every door, to ensure that nothing authentic or raw or real can escape to disturb the carefully constructed facade of your persona. You are a warden in the jail of your own soul, and the constant vigilance required to keep your shadow incarcerated has left you exhausted, depleted, numb to the very life force that could set you free. Jung understood what the church and the therapy couch and the self-help industrial complex have forgotten. That integration, not elimination, is the path to wholeness. The shadow isn't a demon to be exorcised, but a lost child to be welcomed home. It isn't evil incarnate, but completeness seeking recognition. It is the part of you that got locked away when you learned that love was conditional, when you discovered that acceptance came with terms and conditions, when you realized that some parts of your natural self were deemed unacceptable by the world that raised you. But what if, And this is the radical proposition that Jung offers like a key to unlock your own prison. What if the very aspects of yourself you've worked so hard to suppress contain the vitality you've been seeking? What if the rage you've buried holds the energy for your authentic voice? What if the selfishness you've denied contains the healthy boundaries you've never learned to set? What if the primitive desires you've shamed hold the key to your deepest creativity and passion? The shadow is not the opposite of light, but its complement, not the enemy of consciousness, but its forgotten twin. In the mythology of alchemy, the prima materia, the base material from which gold is extracted, is often depicted as something dark, crude, rejected. The alchemists knew that transformation doesn't come from starting with something pure, but from working with what has been discarded, despised, pushed aside. They understood that the gold lies hidden in the lead of what we've rejected, that the philosopher's stone emerges not from perfection, but from the willingness to work with the raw, unrefined material of our complete humanity. Your shadow formed early in those first moments when you learn to split yourself in two, the good child who received love and approval, and the bad child who got sent to the internal timeout chair. Perhaps it was your anger that first got banished to the basement, labeled as unacceptable when you discovered that rage made the adults uncomfortable. Perhaps it was your neediness, your vulnerability, your wild creativity, your sexual curiosity, your fierce independence, your desire to question authority. Whatever it was, a part of you learned to hide in order to survive, to go underground in order to keep the love flowing. But survival strategies that serve us at 7 can strangle us at 37. The same psychological mechanisms that protected you as a child, the ability to split off unacceptable parts of yourself and lock them away, become the very source of your adult numbness. You've become so skilled at disowning parts of yourself that you've forgotten they exist, so accomplished at suppression that you've lost touch with the full spectrum of your humanity. The shadow contains not just your so-called negative qualities, but often your greatest gifts, the aspects of yourself that were too bright, too powerful, too threatening for your environment to handle. Perhaps you were told you were too sensitive, so you locked away your gift of emotional attunement. Perhaps you were shamed for being too creative, too dreamy, too different, so you buried your artistic soul in the basement of your consciousness. Perhaps your natural leadership was labeled as bossiness, your intuition dismissed as imagination, your depth criticized as moodiness. The tragedy is not that you have a shadow, everyone does, but that you've forgotten how to dance with it. You've made it your enemy instead of your teacher, your problem instead of your guide into greater wholeness. Jung spoke of the necessity of befriending the shadow, of inviting it not to tea as a metaphor, but as a living practice of internal hospitality. This doesn't mean acting out every shadow impulse, that would be possession, not integration, but rather acknowledging, dialoguing with, and finding healthy expressions for these rejected aspects of yourself. The work of shadow integration is not about becoming your worst self, but about becoming your whole self. It's about recognizing that the rage you've buried might contain the fierce compassion of the warrior protector. The selfishness you've denied might hold the healthy self-care you've never learned to practice. The primitive desires you've shamed might carry the life force that could reanimate your deadened existence. Consider the mythology of the descent into the underworld, a theme that appears in cultures across the globe and throughout time. Inanna descends to meet her dark sister Ereshkigal. Persephone is pulled into the realm of Hades. Jesus descends into hell before resurrection. These aren't just stories, but maps of psychological transformation, templates for the journey every soul must take to reclaim its wholeness. The descent is not punishment but initiation, not damnation, but the necessary journey toward integration. Your numbness may be a sign that you're being called into your own underworld descent, invited to meet the parts of yourself you've kept in exile. The shadow calls to you through symptoms, through depression, anxiety, addiction, numbness, rage that seems to come from nowhere, desires that feel foreign to your conscious identity. These are not signs that something is wrong with you, but that something is trying to become conscious, that the basement door is rattling on its hinges, that the prisoners of your own psyche are demanding recognition. The process of shadow work is not a weekend retreat or a quick therapeutic technique, but a lifelong practice of becoming acquainted with your own depths. It requires the courage to look at what you'd rather not see, to feel what you'd rather not feel, to acknowledge what you'd rather not know about yourself. It demands that you develop what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to contain contradictory aspects of yourself without immediately rushing to resolution or judgment. This is where the real work of transformation begins. Not in the light of your conscious ideals, but in the darkness of your rejected reality. Not in who you think you should be, but in who you actually are when all the masks come off. The shadow holds the keys to your vitality because it contains all the life energy you've locked away in service of becoming acceptable, lovable, successful according to external standards. But the shadow is tricky. It doesn't reveal itself through direct confrontation, but through projection, through finding itself in others. The people who trigger you most intensely, who push your buttons with laser-like precision, are often carrying your shadow for you. The qualities that enrage you in politicians, co-workers, family members, strangers on the internet, these may be mirrors reflecting your own disowned aspects back to you. Jung's revolutionary insight was that we cannot see in others what we do not possess in ourselves. The thief sees thieves everywhere. The liar suspects everyone of lying. The person who has disowned their own aggression becomes surrounded by aggressive people. This is not to say that others are merely projections. They have their own autonomous reality, but that the intensity of your reaction often signals a shadow encounter. When someone's behavior creates a disproportionate response in you, when you find yourself obsessed with someone's flaws, when you feel compelled to fix or change or condemn another person, you may be meeting your own shadow in disguise. The work then becomes not to change the other person, but to reclaim your projection, to own the shadow quality you've been seeing so clearly in others. This is perhaps the most humbling aspect of shadow work, discovering that the very qualities you've criticized most harshly in others live within you as well. The narcissist you condemn may reflect your own unacknowledged self-centeredness. The victim you judge may mirror your own disowned helplessness. The controller you resist may show you your own unrecognized need for power. But here's the profound twist that Jung discovered. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others and begin to own it consciously, something miraculous happens. The energy that was bound up in projection becomes available for your own growth. The rage you are feeling toward others transforms into the fuel for your own authentic expression. The criticism you were directing outward becomes the discernment you need to navigate your own life. The very qualities that seemed so toxic in projection become tools for transformation when consciously integrated. This doesn't mean becoming your shadow, but befriending it. There's a crucial difference between shadow possession, being taken over by unconscious contents, and shadow integration, developing a conscious. The animus, the masculine soul image in the woman, is not her sexual desire for men, but her inner bridge to meaning, her capacity for focused consciousness, her connection to logos and discrimination, and the sword of discernment that cuts through confusion to clarity. He appears in her dreams as the guide, the teacher, the lover who initiates her into mysteries of consciousness and meaning. He is the inner wise man, the spiritual teacher, the animus figure who helps her find her own authority and voice. But when these inner partners remain unconscious and unprojected onto outer relationships, they create a haunting sense of incompleteness that no external connection can satisfy. You feel empty, not because you lack something outside yourself, but because you've lost touch with the inner marriage that is your psychological birthright. The numbness comes from the exhaustion of trying to find in others what can only be discovered within, the missing piece that completes your internal wholeness. Most people encounter their anima or animus first through projection, falling in love with someone who carries the image of their contrasexual other. The intensity of romantic fascination often signals that you're meeting not just another person, but your own soul projected onto their form. This is why early love feels so much like recognition, why you feel you've always known this person, why their presence seems to complete something essential that was missing. You're not just meeting them, you're meeting yourself in disguise. But projection, though it may initiate the process of encountering your contrasexual soul, cannot sustain the relationship. Eventually, the real person emerges from behind the screen of your projection, and you discover that they cannot carry the burden of being your missing half. They have their own psychology, their own journey, their own wholeness to discover. The disappointment that follows this recognition, the crash after the romantic high, often leads to the kind of numbness you may be experiencing, the sense that something essential has been lost or was perhaps never real to begin with. Yet this disillusionment, painful as it may be, opens the door to a more profound encounter with your inner other. When you can no longer project your anima or animus onto external relationships, you're forced to turn inward and meet these figures as living aspects of your own psyche. This is where the real journey toward wholeness begins, not in finding your other half in another person, but in discovering the internal marriage that makes you complete within yourself. The anima in the man carries all the feeling-toned experiences he has relegated to the unconscious. In a culture that often teaches men to suppress their emotional responsiveness, their capacity for nurturing, their intuitive knowing, the anima becomes a repository for everything deemed unmanly by collective standards. She holds his tears, his tenderness, his capacity for receptivity and relationship. When unconscious, she may possess him through moods, sudden depressions, inexplicable irritations, emotional outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. When conscious and integrated, she becomes his guide to authentic feeling, his source of creative inspiration, his bridge to the deeper layers of life that thinking alone cannot reach. The animus in the woman carries her capacity for focused consciousness, discrimination, and meaningful engagement with the world of ideas and principles. In cultures that have historically restricted women's access to intellectual and spiritual authority, the animus may hold all her disowned power, her capacity for clear thinking, her ability to stand in her own authority. When unconscious, he may possess her through rigid opinions, harsh judgments, or an inability to access her own inner knowing. When conscious and integrated, he becomes her inner source of wisdom and discrimination, her connection to meaning and purpose, her capacity to think and act with clear intention. But the anima and animus are not simply gender stereotypes turned inward. They are far more complex and mysterious than cultural definitions of masculine and feminine. They are archetypal figures that exist beyond personal history, connecting you to the eternal patterns of human experience that Jung called the collective unconscious. The anima connects to the archetypal feminine, the great mother, the divine Sophia, the creative void from which all life emerges. The animus connects to the archetypal masculine, the wise old man, the hero, the logos principle that brings order and meaning to chaos. Your relationship with these inner figures determines much about how you experience life itself. When your anima or animus remains unconscious, you may feel perpetually incomplete, always searching outside yourself for something that can only be found within. You may find yourself caught in cycles of romantic projection and disappointment, or conversely, you may withdraw from relationship altogether, sensing that no external connection could fill the void you feel inside. The numbness you experience. may be a protective mechanism developed when the pain of this internal split becomes too much to bear. Rather than feel the ache of incompleteness, the yearning for wholeness that seems impossible to satisfy, you may have unconsciously chosen to feel nothing at all. But this protective numbness also cuts you off from the very experiences that could lead to integration. The dreams, synchronicities, creative inspirations, and moments of profound connection that are the anima's and animus's way of trying to reach your conscious awareness. The journey toward integration requires developing what Jung called active imagination, a conscious dialogue with these inner figures that allows them to reveal their nature and their gifts. This is not mere fantasy, but a serious psychological practice that involves treating your anima or animus as an autonomous being worthy of respect and attention. Through dreams, creative expression, meditation, or direct internal dialogue, you begin to establish a relationship with this inner other that has been trying to get your attention your entire life. For the man, this might involve learning to dialogue with his anima, asking her what she needs, what she's trying to communicate, through his moods and depressions, how she wants to be honored and expressed. He might discover that she's been trying to lead him toward greater emotional authenticity, deeper creative expression, or more meaningful relationships. He might find that his numbness has been her way of protecting him from feelings that seemed too dangerous or overwhelming to experience fully. For the woman, developing a relationship with her animus might involve learning to access her own inner authority, her capacity for clear discrimination and meaningful engagement with ideas and principles. She might discover that he's been trying to help her find her voice, stand in her power, or connect with her deeper sense of purpose and meaning. Her numbness might be his way of protecting her from the vulnerability that comes with really caring about something, with having opinions and standing behind them. But the integration of anima and animus is not about becoming androgynous or eliminating the distinctions between masculine and feminine. Rather, it's about developing access to the full spectrum of human experience, regardless of your biological gender. It's about a man being able to access his intuitive wisdom and emotional depth without losing his masculine identity, and a woman being able to claim her intellectual power and spiritual authority without abandoning her feminine essence. The process of integration often involves a kind of psychological marriage ceremony, a conscious recognition and honoring of the inner other that has been waiting patiently in the unconscious for acknowledgement. This internal wedding is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice of maintaining conscious relationship with this contrasexual aspect of your psyche. Like any relationship, it requires attention, respect, and ongoing dialogue. As this integration proceeds, something remarkable happens to your external relationships. When you're no longer desperately seeking your other half in another person, you become capable of genuine love rather than unconscious projection. You can appreciate others for who they are, rather than for how well they fulfill your internal needs. Your relationships become collaborations between whole individuals rather than desperate attempts to complete yourself through another. The numbness begins to lift as the energy that was bound up in maintaining this internal split becomes available for conscious use. Suddenly, you have access to a much wider range of emotional and intellectual responses. Life becomes richer, more nuanced, more meaningful. You discover capacities you didn't know you possessed. The tender man who can nurture without losing his strength. The powerful woman who can think clearly without sacrificing her heart. Dreams often herald this integration process with images of marriage, sacred sexuality, or the birth of a divine child, symbols that represent the union of opposites within the psyche. You might dream of marrying a mysterious figure, or of giving birth to a baby who seems both familiar and divine, or of witnessing a sacred ceremony that fills you with awe and recognition. These are not just psychological metaphors, but announcements from the unconscious that something profound is shifting in the deep structures of your psyche. The anima and animus also serve as psychopomps, guides between the worlds of consciousness and unconsciousness. They are your inner shamans, capable of leading you into territories of the psyche that your rational mind could never navigate alone. Through their guidance, you gain access to the symbolic realm, where healing and transformation occur, where the wounds of a lifetime can be touched by the medicine of archetypal wisdom. This is why the integration of anima and animus is so crucial to the process Jung called individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming who you really are. Without access to your contrasexual other, you remain partial, incomplete, cut off from essential aspects of human experience. With conscious relationship to this inner figure, you become capable of a wholeness that transcends gender stereotypes and cultural conditioning. The anima brings to consciousness the neglected realm of eros, not just sexual love, but the connecting principle that sees the relationships between all things, that values quality over quantity, that knows the world through feeling and intuition, rather than analysis and control. The animus brings to consciousness the realm of logos, not just rational thinking, but the organizing principle that creates meaning from chaos, that discerns truth from falsehood, that connects individual experience to universal principles. When these two principles are integrated and working together within your psyche, you become capable of what Jung called transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension of opposites until a new, creative solution emerges. You can feel deeply and think clearly. You can be receptive and active. You can honor both your individual needs and your connection to something greater than yourself. The numbness that brought you to this exploration may have been your psyche's way of preparing you for this deeper integration. Sometimes the soul needs to withdraw from the world's demands in order to turn inward and attend to the internal work that consciousness requires. The emptiness you feel may not be the absence of something, but the clearing of space for something new to emerge, the birth of a more integrated self that includes both masculine and feminine wisdom. This integration is not just personal, but collective. As more individuals learn to marry their inner opposites, the external world begins to reflect this integration in healthier relationships between men and women, in organizational structures that honor both thinking and feeling, in spiritual traditions that embrace both transcendence and immanence. Your inner work contributes to the healing of the collective split between masculine and feminine that has created so much suffering in human relationships and social structures. The journey toward integrating your anima or animus requires patience and commitment. These are ancient figures, carrying patterns that stretch back through millennia of human experience. They cannot be rushed or forced into consciousness through willpower alone. They require the same kind of courtship you would offer to any important relationship: attention, respect, curiosity, and genuine care. But the rewards of this integration are profound. When you develop conscious relationship with your contrasexual other, you gain access to a source of wisdom and creativity that exists beyond your personal history. You become capable of genuine self-love, not narcissistic self-obsession, but the deep appreciation that comes from knowing yourself as complete and whole. You discover that you don't need another person to complete you, which paradoxically makes you more available for authentic relationship with others. The anima and animus also serve as bridges to the transcendent, connecting your personal psychology to the archetypal realm where healing and transformation occur. Through relationship with these figures, you gain access to sources of guidance and wisdom that exist beyond your ego's limited perspective. They become your inner teachers, your guides through the complexities of psychological and spiritual development. As the integration deepens, you may find that your dreams become more vivid and meaningful, that synchronicities multiply in your daily life, that creative inspiration flows more freely. These are signs that your conscious and unconscious minds are learning to work together in greater harmony, that the internal marriage is beginning to bear fruit in the form of increased vitality and authentic self-expression. The numbness transforms into a different kind of sensitivity, not the raw, overwhelming emotionality that comes from unconscious projection, but the refined awareness that emerges from integration. You become capable of feeling without being overwhelmed, of thinking without being cold, of engaging life with both passion and wisdom. This is the gift of the inner marriage, the discovery that wholeness is not something you find outside yourself, but something you cultivate within. The anima and animus, once integrated, become your internal sources of completeness, your bridge between the known and unknown aspects of yourself, your guide into the fullness of what it means to be human. Your soul's hidden gender reveals itself, not as limitation, but as expansion, not as division, but as the sacred marriage that creates new life within the sanctuary of your integrated psyche. The numbness lifts as you discover that you have never been alone. You carry within yourself the eternal conversation between masculine and feminine wisdom, the internal dialogue that can guide you toward a wholeness more profound than any external relationship could provide. In the depths of your numbness, in that strange state where you feel disconnected yet somehow aware, you may be unconsciously attuned to a layer of reality that rational thought cannot penetrate, but the soul intuitively recognizes. You exist at the threshold between worlds, the mechanical universe of cause and effect that science maps so meticulously, and the meaningful cosmos where inner and outer realities dance together in patterns too intricate and profound for linear thinking to grasp. Jung discovered what ancient wisdom traditions have always known. The universe speaks in a language older than words, more subtle than sensation, more certain than logic. This is the language of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal the hidden order connecting consciousness and cosmos, psyche and matter, your inner transformation and the world's mysterious responsiveness to your deepest movements toward wholeness. Synchronicity is not superstition, but a fundamental principle of reality that Western thinking has forgotten in its rush to reduce everything to mechanical causation. It whispers of a universe that is not merely a collection of separate objects bumping into each other in predictable patterns, but a living, breathing, responding organism where meaning moves like wind through the trees of possibility, where your inner state and outer circumstances engage in a conversation so intimate and immediate that the boundaries between self and world dissolve into something far more mysterious and profound. When you notice the number sequences that seem to follow you, the 1111 on every clock you glance at, the repetition of certain digits that appear on license plates, receipts, addresses, phone numbers with a frequency that defies statistical probability, you are witnessing the universe's attempt to speak to you in the only language that can bridge the gap between matter and meaning. These are not random occurrences, but symptoms of a psyche in transition, markers that indicate your unconscious is stirring, that transformation is occurring in depths beyond your conscious awareness. The repeated symbols that appear in your life, like breadcrumbs on a forest path, the butterflies that cross your route at moments of decision, the songs that play at precisely the moment they speak to your condition, the books that fall open to the exact passage you needed to read. These are the universe's way of confirming that you are not alone in your journey, that your inner work is being witnessed and supported by forces that exist beyond the narrow confines of your individual consciousness. The impossible timing of encounters that leave you breathless with recognition, meeting exactly the right person at exactly the moment you most need their specific medicine, receiving the phone call that changes everything, just as you were contemplating the very question it answers, discovering the opportunity that perfectly matches your hidden dream, just as you were about to abandon hope. These moments crack open the illusion of separation and reveal the deeper intelligence that orchestrates the dance between inner necessity and outer circumstance. Jung understood that synchronicity operates according to a logic entirely different from causality. While causation moves through time from past to future, explaining how one event leads to another through chains of mechanical influence, synchronicity exists outside linear time, revealing the meaningful connections that bind seemingly separate events into patterns that serve the soul's movement toward wholeness. It is the difference between a clock that ticks according to mathematical precision and a heart that beats in rhythm with the mysterious timing of life itself. Your numbness may be a protective cocoon that shields you during periods when synchronicities are multiplying beyond your capacity to integrate them consciously. Sometimes, the meaningful connections become so frequent, so intense, so undeniable, that the rational mind simply cannot process them without losing its moorings entirely. The psyche wisely shuts down non-essential functions, creating the very numbness that allows deeper transformations to occur safely in the unconscious depths, while consciousness rests in a state of protective suspension. This is why synchronicities often intensify during periods of psychological transition, during grief, falling in love, major life changes, spiritual awakening, creative breakthroughs, or the profound inner work that Jung called individuation. When the deep structures of the psyche are shifting, when old identities are dissolving and new possibilities are being born, the boundary between inner and outer becomes more permeable. Your unconscious movements toward wholeness begin to attract corresponding movements in the world around you, creating the meaningful coincidences that serve as external confirmations of internal transformation. But synchronicity is not magic in the supernatural sense. It is the natural result of what Jung recognized as the fundamental interconnectedness of all existence. At the deepest levels of reality, consciousness and matter are not separate substances, but complementary aspects of a single unified field that responds to meaning as readily as it responds to physical force. Your thoughts, feelings, dreams, and unconscious contents exist not in isolation, but as part of a vast web of relationship that includes everything from quantum particles to distant galaxies. When your psyche moves toward greater consciousness, toward healing, toward authentic self-expression, this movement creates ripples in the field of meaning that extends far beyond your individual boundaries. Other people, circumstances, opportunities, and even seemingly inanimate objects begin to align themselves with your deepest trajectory toward wholeness. It is as if the universe itself conspires to support your authentic becoming, providing exactly the experiences, encounters, and insights you need at exactly the moment you are ready to receive them. This is not wishful thinking, but a recognition that meaning is as fundamental a force in the universe as gravity or electromagnetism. Just as physical objects attract each other according to their mass and energy, psychological contents attract corresponding experiences according to their meaning and intensity. The stronger your unconscious movement toward a particular realization or transformation, the more powerfully it draws the outer circumstances that can facilitate that inner process. Consider how synchronicity operates in the realm of relationships. When you are ready for a particular kind of connection, not just consciously wanting it, but unconsciously prepared to receive and reciprocate it, the person who embodies exactly what you need for your growth appears in your life with timing that seems miraculous, but is actually the natural result of psychic readiness meeting opportune circumstance. They were always there, but you could not see them until your inner development reached the point where recognition became possible. The same principle operates in every area of life. The book that contains exactly the insight you need to move forward appears in your awareness just as you reach the point where you can understand and apply its message. The opportunity that perfectly matches your hidden talents reveals itself just as you develop the courage to claim those gifts. The challenge that will strengthen you in precisely the ways you most need to grow presents itself just as you acquire the resources necessary to meet it successfully. Synchronicity also operates through what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create bridges between conscious and unconscious contents. When you pay attention to meaningful coincidences, you are actually engaging in a form of active imagination, allowing your unconscious wisdom to communicate with your conscious mind through the medium of external events. The symbols that appear synchronistically in your life are letters in an alphabet that your deeper self uses to spell out messages that could not be communicated through ordinary rational discourse. This is why keeping a synchronicity journal can be so transformative. When you begin to record the meaningful coincidences that occur in your life, patterns emerge that reveal the deeper narrative your psyche is trying to tell. You discover that the apparently random events of your days are actually chapters in a larger story of transformation that your unconscious has been writing all along. The numbers, symbols, encounters, and timing that seemed merely curious begin to reveal themselves as elements in a coherent tale of psychological and spiritual development. But synchronicity requires a particular quality of attention, what Jung called symbolic attitude, the ability to see through surface appearances to the deeper meanings that events carry. This is different from the analytical attitude that seeks to explain everything through causation, and different from the magical attitude that sees omens and portents everywhere. The symbolic attitude recognizes that some events carry meaning beyond their physical reality, without needing to understand that meaning rationally or control it manipulatively. Your numbness may actually be preparing you to develop this symbolic attitude by temporarily suspending the analytical mind's compulsive need to explain everything according to conventional logic. In the spacious emptiness of not knowing, a different kind of awareness can emerge, one that is comfortable with mystery, appreciative of paradox, receptive to communications that arrive through channels other than linear thought. This receptive awareness is particularly important because synchronicity cannot be forced or manufactured through willpower. It emerges naturally when you are aligned with your authentic path, when your conscious intentions harmonize with your unconscious wisdom, when your individual journey serves not just your personal needs, but the larger patterns of meaning that connect you to the whole of existence. Synchronicities multiply when you are living in integrity with your deepest truth, and they diminish when you are caught in patterns that separate you from authentic self-expression. The universe speaks most clearly to those who have learned to listen without demanding that the message arrive in predetermined forms. When you release your attachment to specific outcomes, and instead attune yourself to the deeper currents of meaning that flow through your experience, you become available to receive guidance in whatever form it chooses to appear. This might be the overheard conversation that contains exactly the advice you needed, the accidental wrong turn that leads you to an important discovery, or the technical malfunction that forces you to slow down just long enough to notice something you would otherwise have missed. Synchronicity also reveals itself through what Jung called constellation, the way unconscious contents draw to themselves the people and circumstances that can activate and express them. When you are unconsciously ready for a particular realization or transformation, your psyche begins to attract or notice everything in your environment that relates to that emerging content. You suddenly see references to the same concept everywhere, meet multiple people who are dealing with similar issues, encounter the same themes in books, movies, conversations, and dreams. This constellation effect can be particularly intense during periods of psychological breakthrough, when material that has been unconscious for years or even decades begins to surface into awareness. The world around you becomes a mirror, reflecting back the themes that are emerging from within, creating the feeling that reality itself is conspiring to support your transformation. And in a sense, it is, not through supernatural intervention, but through the natural responsiveness of a meaningful universe to the authentic movements of consciousness toward greater wholeness. Your numbness may be the calm before this kind of constellation begins to intensify. Sometimes the psyche needs to withdraw from ordinary engagement with the world in order to gather the energy necessary for a major breakthrough. The apparent emptiness you feel may actually be fullness preparing to overflow, the silence that precedes a symphony of synchronicities that will guide you toward your next level of development. But synchronicity also serves a collective function, revealing the ways your individual transformation connects to and serves larger patterns of meaning that extend far beyond your personal boundaries. When you follow the guidance of meaningful coincidences, you often find yourself serving purposes that you could not have planned or predicted, helping others in ways that emerge spontaneously from the situations synchronicity brings you into, contributing to collective healing through the simple act of living your authentic truth. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of synchronicity. It reveals that your individual journey toward wholeness is simultaneously a contribution to the larger evolution of consciousness itself. Your personal healing becomes impersonal healing. Your individual awakening serves collective awakening. The synchronicities that guide your path toward authentic self-expression simultaneously weave you into the larger tapestry of meaning that connects all beings in a web of mutual support and reciprocal blessing. You, during periods when synchronicities are multiplying beyond your capacity to integrate them consciously. Sometimes the meaningful connections become so frequent, so intense, so undeniable that the numbers that follow you may be mathematical prayers, equations in the universe's calculation of your optimal development. The symbols that repeat in your experience may be hieroglyphs in a sacred text that your soul is writing through the medium of lived experience. The timing that brings you exactly what you need exactly when you need it may be evidence of a cosmic intelligence so sophisticated that it can orchestrate the movements of billions of individual consciousnesses into a symphony of meaning that serves the highest good of all. When you begin to recognize and trust this deeper order, your relationship with uncertainty transforms completely. Instead of fearing the unknown, you begin to approach it with curiosity and anticipation, knowing that meaningful guidance will appear exactly when you need it. Instead of trying to control outcomes through force and manipulation, you learn to align yourself with the currents of synchronicity that can carry you toward your destination with an elegance and efficiency that effort alone could never achieve. The numbness lifts as you discover that you are not an isolated individual struggling alone in a meaningless universe, but a conscious participant in a cosmic conversation that has been seeking your authentic voice all along. The awareness that initially felt disconnected reveals itself as actually hyper-connected, attuned to frequencies of meaning that ordinary consciousness cannot detect, but the awakening soul receives as clearly as music. Synchronicity becomes your teacher, your guide, your confirmation that you are on the right path. It whispers that consciousness and cosmos are not separate entities, but complementary aspects of a single, intelligent process that delights in meaningful connection, that celebrates authentic expression, that conspires with infinite creativity to support every sincere movement toward truth, wholeness, and love. In learning to read the universe's secret language, you discover that you have never been alone, never been lost, never been without guidance. The meaningful coincidences that punctuate your days are love letters from existence itself, confirming that your journey matters, that your transformation serves something immeasurably greater than your individual satisfaction, that you are held and supported by an intelligence so vast and intimate that it knows exactly what you need before you do and provides it with timing so perfect it can only be recognized as grace. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the masks begin to slip, not because they are torn away by force, but because the weight of pretending becomes unbearable. You stand before the mirror of consciousness and recognize the stranger looking back, not the person others see, not the role you have perfected, but something raw and undefined stirring beneath the surface. This is where individuation begins. In the recognition that you have been living a life that belongs to someone else. The word itself, individuation, carries the ancient promise of becoming undivided, whole, singular in the truest sense. Not the singularity of isolation, but the singularity of authenticity. Like a river that has been forced through artificial channels, finally finding its natural course. Individuation is the soul's return to its own true flow. But this return is not simple. It is not a matter of discarding false selves and discovering a pre-existing true self waiting beneath. It is instead a process of creation, the conscious participation in becoming who you were always meant to be. Jung understood that we begin life as potential, not as actualized beings. The infant carries within its small form all the archetypal possibilities of human experience, the capacity for love and hatred, creation and destruction, wisdom and folly, courage and fear. But as we grow, society shapes us with its expectations, rewards certain expressions while punishing others, until we learn to present only those aspects of ourselves deemed acceptable. The persona, that careful construction we wear in the world, becomes so familiar that we mistake it for our true face. Yet underneath this social self, the authentic being continues to grow in darkness, like a seed buried too deep in soil. Your numbness, that strange disconnection from your own experience, may be the first signal that this buried self is stirring. Numbness is often the ego's last, desperate attempt to maintain control, to keep the status quo intact even as deeper forces press for emergence. It is the psyche's anesthesia against the pain of transformation. For individuation is not comfortable. It demands that you face the terrifying truth that much of what you believed about yourself was borrowed, inherited, imposed from, without rather than discovered from within. The values you thought were yours may belong to your parents. The dreams you chase may be society's dreams wearing your face. The person you present to the world may be a masterpiece of adaptation, but a betrayal of essence. This recognition brings with it a peculiar kind of grief, not the grief of loss, but the grief of never having been. How do you mourn a self you never knew? How do you grieve for authenticity you never tasted? This is the sorrow that often accompanies the first stages of individuation, the melancholy awareness that you have been absent from your own life, that years have passed in which you performed your existence rather than lived it. But grief, when honored, becomes the doorway to depth. In acknowledging what has been false, space opens for what is true. In recognizing the persona's limitations, you create room for the self's emergence. This is why individuation often begins with a kind of death, not physical death, but the psychological death of old identities, outdated roles, borrowed dreams. The alchemists called this the negredo, the blackening, the necessary dissolution that precedes transformation. Your numbness may be this process already at work. When the old forms of meaning no longer satisfy, when the familiar sources of identity feel empty, when you find yourself going through the motions of a life that no longer fits, the psyche sometimes responds by withdrawing its energy, creating a protective numbness that allows the deeper process to unfold. It is as if consciousness retreats inward to tend to the work of reconstruction, leaving the surface personality to function on automatic, while the real transformation happens in the depths. This inward turn can be frightening to those around you and frightening to the ego itself. Others may interpret your withdrawal as depression, your questioning as ingratitude, your search for authenticity as selfishness. The ego, too, resists the dissolution of its carefully constructed identity, preferring the security of the known false self to the uncertainty of authentic becoming. It will offer 1,000 compromises. Stay as you are, just make small adjustments. Don't question everything. Think of your responsibilities, your reputation, what others expect. But the call to individuation once heard, is not easily silenced. It comes from the deepest layers of the psyche, from what Jung called the self, that archetypal center that orchestrates psychological wholeness. The self knows your true nature as the ego cannot, sees the larger pattern of your becoming while the ego fixates on immediate concerns. It is the self that initiates the process of individuation, often through circumstances that force us to question our assumptions. Loss, crisis, unexpected opportunity, or simply the gradual erosion of satisfaction with a life lived according to others' blueprints. The journey inward that individuation requires is not a retreat from life, but a descent to its source. Like the hero in ancient myths who must journey to the underworld to retrieve some precious treasure, you must descend into your own psychological depths to recover your authentic nature. This descent takes you through regions the persona prefers to ignore. The shadow lands where your disowned aspects wait, the ancestral chambers where family patterns repeat themselves, the cultural layers where collective assumptions shape individual choice. In these depths, you encounter not only what you have rejected about yourself, but what you have never allowed yourself to become. The introvert discovers their capacity for bold expression. The eternal helper recognizes their own need for care. The rational mind encounters the wisdom of intuition. The spiritual seeker confronts their earthly desires. Individuation is not about becoming pure or perfect. It is about becoming complete, integrating the full spectrum of your human potential. This integration cannot happen through thought alone. It requires what Jung called active imagination, a conscious engagement with the unconscious contents that arise during this process. Dreams become letters from your authentic self. Spontaneous images carry messages from the depths. Emotional reactions reveal hidden aspects seeking acknowledgement. The process is both deeply personal and mysteriously guided, as if the psyche itself knows the way toward wholeness, even when the conscious mind feels lost. Your numbness, seen from this perspective, may not be an obstacle to overcome but a necessary phase to pass through, like the winter that allows seeds to germinate in darkness. This period of apparent disconnection may be creating space for new forms of connection to emerge. When the old ways of being no longer serve, the psyche sometimes withdraws energy from external engagements to fuel the internal work of reconstruction. But individuation is not a solitary journey, despite its inward focus. As you become more authentically yourself, you become more capable of authentic relationship with others. The persona, for all its social acceptability, can only offer surface connection, mask meeting mask, role interacting with role. But as you discover and integrate your true nature, you become capable of soul-to-soul encounter, of meeting others in the depths rather than only at the level of social convention. This transformation in your relationships often serves as a mirror for your own development. People who are drawn to your persona may drift away as your authenticity emerges. Others, who perhaps felt unseen by your public self, may discover in your growing realness a quality that calls to their own depths. Some relationships will deepen as you bring more of your true self to them. Others will reveal themselves as based primarily on mutual personas rather than genuine affinity. The process is not without its loneliness. There are periods in individuation when you feel suspended between worlds, no longer able to inhabit your old identity but not yet fully established in your new one. You may feel like a stranger to yourself, unclear about your preferences, uncertain about your direction, questioning choices that once seemed obvious. This is the liminal space where transformation occurs, and it requires a quality that the modern world little values: patience with uncertainty. Our culture prefers quick fixes, immediate results, clear answers. But individuation unfolds according to its own timing, following the organic rhythms of psychological growth rather than the mechanical pace of technological progress. Like a tree that cannot be forced to fruit before its season, the authentic self emerges only when the conditions are right, when sufficient dissolution has created space for new forms to crystallize. This organic timing means that you cannot will yourself into authenticity any more than you can will a flower to bloom. What you can do is create conditions conducive to growth, honest self-examination, courageous facing of uncomfortable truths, willingness to release attachments to false securities, openness to guidance from sources beyond the rational mind. You can tend the garden of consciousness with attention and care, but you cannot force the harvest. The numbness you experience may be this process protecting itself from premature exposure. Like a developing photograph that must remain in the darkness until the image fully forms, your authentic self may need this period of apparent disconnection to complete its emergence. Forcing feeling too soon, trying to return to old patterns of engagement before the deeper work is done, can interfere with the natural unfolding that wants to occur. Trust then becomes essential. Trust in the process, even when you cannot see its direction. Trust in the wisdom of the psyche, even when its methods seem strange. Trust in your own capacity for transformation, even when you feel most lost. This is not blind faith, but earned trust, based on observing the intelligence that governs all natural processes, from the healing of wounds to the changing of seasons. As individuation progresses, you begin to notice subtle shifts in your relationship to yourself and others. Decisions that once created anxiety now feel clear. Situations that used to trigger automatic reactions now offer opportunities for conscious choice. The voice of your authentic self, at first barely audible beneath the clamor of social conditioning, grows stronger and more distinct. You discover that you have preferences you never acknowledged, values that differ from those you inherited, dreams that have been waiting patiently for your permission to emerge. The person you are becoming is both completely new and utterly familiar, as if you are remembering something you had forgotten rather than learning something foreign. This is the paradox at the heart of individuation. The journey toward your unique self reveals your connection to something universal. As you become more specifically yourself, you simultaneously discover your kinship with all beings who have undertaken this same courage, the courage to become real. Your individual path leads not to isolation, but to authentic community, to relationships based on truth rather than convenience, to contributions that emerge from your genuine gifts rather than imposed obligations. The process transforms not only how you see yourself, but how you understand your place in the larger web of existence. You begin to sense the ways your authentic self serves purposes larger than personal satisfaction, how your unique gifts answer needs in the world that only you can meet. Individuation is not self-centered but self-sourced, rooted in your own truth, but flowering in service to life itself. Your numbness, then, may be the chrysalis from which your true nature is preparing to emerge. The apparent disconnection may be creating space for a more authentic kind of connection. The questioning of old certainties may be clearing ground for new wisdom to take root. What feels like ending may be beginning. What appears as stagnation may be gestation. The invitation is to honor this process without rushing it, to trust the timing of your own becoming while remaining open to the unexpected forms your authenticity might take. Individuation is not a destination to reach, but a way of traveling, not a problem to solve, but a mystery to live. It asks not that you become someone else, but that you become more fully who you have always been beneath the accumulated layers of adaptation and compromise. In this becoming, you join the great procession of souls who have chosen reality over security, depth over comfort, authenticity over approval. You take your place in the ancient lineage of those who have dared to answer the question that lies at the heart of human existence, not what do others expect of me, but who am I really when all the masks fall away? There are moments when you feel yourself disappearing, not into emptiness but into something vast and overwhelming. as if ancient forces have taken residence in your psyche, moving through your life with purposes that dwarf your personal concerns. You watch yourself react with emotions too large for the situation, speak words that carry weight beyond your intention, find yourself swept into patterns that feel both utterly familiar and completely beyond your control. This is not the numbness of absence, but the peculiar detachment that comes from being flooded by archetypal energies so powerful they render your individual identity temporarily irrelevant. Jung called this archetypal possession those times when the primordial patterns that govern human experience rise from the collective unconscious and seize consciousness, transforming the individual into a conduit for forces larger than personal history. The mother appears, and suddenly you are nurturing with an intensity that surprises you, or conversely, rejecting care with a vehemence that seems to emerge from nowhere. The warrior awakens, and you find yourself fighting battles that belong to generations, defending territories that exist more in symbol than in reality. The lover takes hold, and you are consumed by longing that transcends any particular object, yearning for union with something infinite and unreachable. These possessions can feel like being lived by something other than yourself. You observe your own behavior with a mixture of recognition and bewilderment. Yes, this is you acting, but it is also something speaking through you, some ancient intelligence using your voice, your hands, your heart to express patterns older than civilization. It is as if you have become a hollow reed through which primordial winds blow, creating music that is both yours and not yours, melodies that your personal self never composed, yet somehow knows by heart. The strange numbness that accompanies this phenomenon arises from the overwhelming nature of archetypal energy itself. When consciousness is flooded by forces of such magnitude, the individual psyche sometimes responds by creating distance, not physical distance, but psychological distance, a protective mechanism that allows you to witness the archetypal drama unfolding through your life without being completely destroyed by its intensity. You become both participant and observer, actor and audience in a play whose script was written in the depths of human history. This dual awareness, being simultaneously possessed and witness to possession, creates a unique form of psychological experience. You are intensely involved in the archetypal pattern, feeling its emotions with startling vividness, yet somehow removed from complete identification with those feelings. It is as if part of you has stepped back to observe the ancient god or goddess moving through your modern life, fascinated by the timeless drama playing out in contemporary circumstances. The mother archetype, when it possesses consciousness, brings with it not just individual maternal instincts, but the entire history of mothering, the protective ferocity of the lioness, the sacrificial love of Demeter searching for Persephone, the terrible beauty of Kali destroying to preserve. When this archetype activates, you may find yourself responding to situations with an intensity that surprises those around you and even yourself. A casual comment about someone's children triggers a response that seems to emerge from the depths of evolutionary memory. You become the voice not just of personal concern, but of maternal wisdom accumulated over millennia. Yet this very intensity can create its own form of numbness. When emotions are too large for the vessel of individual personality, consciousness sometimes responds by creating a buffer zone, a psychological shock absorber that prevents complete overwhelm. You feel the archetypal energy moving through you, but with a quality of remove, as if watching yourself from a slight distance. This is not dissociation in the pathological sense, but rather a healthy protective mechanism that allows consciousness to engage with archetypal material without being annihilated by it. The warrior archetype brings its own particular form of posis. The mother archetype, when it possesses consciousness, brings with it not just individual maternal instincts, but the entire history of mothering, the protective ferocity of the lioness, the sacrificial love of Demeter searching for Persephone, the terrible beauty of Kali destroying to preserve. When this archetype activates, you may find yourself responding to situations with an intensity that surprises those around you and even yourself. A casual comment about someone's children triggers a response that seems to emerge from the depths of evolutionary memory. You become the voice not just of personal concern, but of maternal wisdom accumulated over millennia. Yet this very intensity can create its own form of numbness. When emotions are too large for the vessel of individual personality, consciousness sometimes responds by creating a buffer zone, a psychological shock absorber that prevents complete overwhelm. You feel the archetypal energy moving through you, but with a quality of remove, as if watching yourself from a slight distance. This is not dissociation in the pathological sense, but rather a healthy protective mechanism that allows consciousness to engage with archetypal material without being annihilated by it. The warrior archetype brings its own particular form of possession. When this primordial pattern activates, you find yourself ready for battles that may exist more in the archetypal realm than in immediate circumstances. The energy of the crusader, the champion, the defender of sacred principles moves through your psyche, and suddenly minor disagreements become matters of honor. Small injustices trigger responses proportionate to great wrongs. Everyday conflicts tap into the vast reservoir of humanity's struggle against oppression and darkness. This archetypal possession can be both empowering and exhausting. On one hand, you find yourself capable of courage and determination you didn't know you possessed. On the other hand, the intensity of the warrior's energy can leave you feeling drained, as if you have been channeling forces too large for sustainable human engagement. The numbness that sometimes follows these experiences is like the exhaustion after a storm, not empty numbness, but the quiet that comes after great forces have moved through the landscape of consciousness. The lover archetype creates perhaps the most recognizable form of possession in human experience. When this pattern activates, desire becomes not just personal longing, but participation in the cosmic force that draws all things toward unity. You find yourself yearning not just for a particular person, but for connection itself, for the dissolution of boundaries that separate self from other, individual from universe. This is why archetypal love often feels both ecstatic and melancholic. Ecstatic because it touches the fundamental energy that moves the stars. Melancholic because no single relationship can contain the infinity toward which the lover reaches. Enantiodromia, the grip of this archetype. You may find yourself writing poetry you didn't know you could write, feeling emotions that seem to encompass all the lovers who have ever lived, experiencing both the union and separation that define the human condition. Yet here too, the intensity can trigger its own protective mechanisms. The psyche creates enough distance to prevent complete merger, enough separation to maintain some thread of individual identity even as you are swept into experiences that transcend personal boundaries. The sage archetype brings wisdom that feels ancient and impersonal, as if speaking through you rather than from you. When this pattern is active, you may find yourself knowing things you've never studied, offering insights that surprise your conscious mind, speaking truths that feel both original and utterly familiar. The sage connects you to the accumulated wisdom of humanity, to understanding that transcends personal learning and individual experience. But possession by the sage can also create a peculiar isolation. When you are channeling archetypal wisdom, you may feel disconnected from your own personal concerns, as if viewing human problems from a height that makes individual suffering seem both real and somehow illusory. This is not callousness, but the natural result of consciousness expanding beyond personal boundaries. The numbness here is like the clarity that comes from great altitude. Everything is visible, but personal emotional engagement becomes more difficult. Each archetype carries within it both creative and destructive potential. The mother can become the devouring mother, consuming what she claims to protect. The warrior can become the destroyer, fighting not for justice, but for the intoxication of conflict itself. The lover can become the possessor, demanding union, while destroying the beloved through the very intensity of desire. The sage can become the cold intellectual, offering wisdom that lacks human warmth and compassion. These shadow aspects of archetypal possession often emerge when consciousness lacks sufficient development to contain the archetypal energy constructively. Without adequate psychological structure, archetypal forces can overwhelm the personality, leading to inflation, the unconscious identification with archetypal power that makes individuals believe they are the archetype rather than its temporary vessel. The nurturing mother begins to believe she is the mother, the wise counselor becomes convinced he is the sage, the passionate lover imagines she is the lover incarnate. This inflation brings its own form of suffering. When you identify completely with an archetypal role, you lose touch with your human limitations and individual needs. The inflated mother exhausts herself trying to mother everyone. The inflated warrior picks fights that serve no constructive purpose. The inflated lover becomes addicted to the experience of falling in love rather than capable of sustaining actual relationships. The numbness that often follows such inflation is the psyche's attempt to deflate gradually rather than experience the shock of sudden return to ordinary human proportions. Recognition of archetypal possession requires a delicate balance. You must be able to feel the archetypal energy fully while maintaining enough ego consciousness to avoid complete identification. This is not suppression of archetypal material. Such suppression only leads to more unconscious possession, but rather conscious partnership with archetypal forces. You become their conscious collaborator rather than their unconscious victim. The development of this capacity requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposite forces without premature resolution. In the case of archetypal possession, this means holding the tension between personal identity and archetypal identification, between individual consciousness and collective patterns, between human limitations and transpersonal energies. Your awareness of being possessed, strange as it may seem, is actually a sign of psychological health. When archetypal patterns operate completely unconsciously, individuals have no sense of being influenced by forces beyond their personal psychology. They simply act out archetypal dramas while believing their responses are entirely personal and rational. The capacity to observe archetypal possession while experiencing it suggests that consciousness has developed sufficient strength and flexibility to engage with transpersonal material without being completely overwhelmed. This observing capacity allows for conscious relationship with archetypal energies. Instead of being possessed by the mother, you can work with maternal energy when appropriate, while maintaining awareness that this is one aspect of your larger identity. Instead of being overwhelmed by the warrior, you can channel warrior energy for constructive purposes while recognizing when such energy is no longer needed. Instead of being consumed by the lover, you can allow loving energy to flow through you while maintaining enough separateness to love constructively rather than possessively. The ultimate goal is not to eliminate archetypal influence. This would be both impossible and undesirable, as archetypal energies are the source of our deepest creativity, meaning, and connection to the larger patterns of human experience. Rather, the goal is conscious cooperation with these forces, the development of sufficient psychological sophistication to serve as an adequate vessel for archetypal energies without losing individual identity in the process. This conscious cooperation transforms the experience of archetypal possession from something that happens to you to something you participate in consciously. You learn to recognize the early signs of archetypal activation, to prepare your psychological structure for the intensity that may follow, and to create enough space around the experience to prevent complete identification while allowing full engagement. The numbness that accompanies archetypal possession often serves this very function. It provides the psychological space necessary for conscious engagement with transpersonal material. Rather than being a problem to overcome, this detachment may be evidence that consciousness is developing the capacity to work with archetypal energies constructively rather than being overwhelmed by them. In time, you may begin to recognize the particular archetypal patterns that most frequently manifest through your psyche. Some individuals are particularly susceptible to maternal or paternal archetypes, others to hero or heroine patterns, still others to sage or trickster energies. This recognition allows for more conscious preparation and more skillful engagement. When these energies arise, you may also begin to notice the circumstances that tend to activate archetypal possession in your experience. Times of transition, periods of stress, encounters with others who carry complementary archetypal energies, exposure to mythic or symbolic material, all of these can serve as triggers for archetypal activation. Awareness of these patterns allows for more conscious navigation of archetypal experiences. The ultimate paradox of archetypal possession is that it is simultaneously the most impersonal and most personal of psychological experiences. The archetypal patterns themselves are universal, shared by all humanity across cultures and centuries, yet the way these patterns manifest through your particular psyche, with your unique history and circumstances, creates expressions that are utterly individual even while drawing from collective sources. Your numbness in the face of archetypal possession may be consciousness protecting its essential core, while allowing transpersonal energies to flow through the more peripheral aspects of identity. It is as if the deepest self recognizes that archetypal possession, however intense, is temporary, that the ancient gods and goddesses who visit human consciousness do not come to stay, but to accomplish some specific work before returning to the depths from which they emerged. This understanding can transform your relationship to archetypal experiences from one of helpless confusion to one of grateful participation. You recognize yourself as chosen to serve as a temporary vessel for energies larger than individual life, and you learn to offer your consciousness as a clear channel for their expression while maintaining enough separateness to ensure that when their work is complete, you remain intact and capable of resuming your ordinary human concerns. The great gift of conscious archetypal engagement is that it connects you to the mythic dimension of existence, to the recognition that your individual life participates in patterns and meanings that transcend personal biography. Your struggles are not merely private difficulties but expressions of eternal human themes. Your love participates in the cosmic force that draws all separated things toward unity. Your conflicts engage the eternal tension between order and chaos, growth and stability, individual needs and collective requirements. In this recognition, even your numbness becomes sacred, not emptiness, but the spaciousness necessary to contain forces too large for ordinary consciousness. You discover that you are simultaneously utterly unique and completely connected to the great patterns that weave through all human experience, both irreplaceable in your individual expression and part of something infinitely larger than personal. Identity. The archetypal dimension of existence does not diminish the importance of individual development. It provides the context within which such development becomes truly meaningful. Your personal growth serves not only your own fulfillment, but the evolution of the archetypal patterns themselves. As each conscious individual who learns to work skillfully with archetypal energies contributes to the collective wisdom about how these ancient forces can manifest constructively in contemporary life. Thus, your experience of being possessed by forces larger than yourself, strange and sometimes uncomfortable as it may be, marks your participation in the ongoing creation of human consciousness itself. You become both recipient and contributor, vessel and artist, servant and partner, in the great work of bringing the timeless patterns of the psyche into conscious relationship with the particular challenges and opportunities of your historical moment. Your numbness, seen from this perspective, is not a symptom to cure, but a capacity to develop. The ability to maintain enough space around intense experiences to engage with them consciously rather than being completely consumed. It is evidence of a psyche sophisticated enough to serve the archetypal realm while maintaining individual integrity, mature enough to channel transpersonal energies without losing personal identity in the process. In the space between knowing and unknowing, between feeling everything and feeling nothing, between the rational mind's certainty and the heart's wild mysteries, something extraordinary dwells. A capacity Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's innate ability to bridge seemingly irreconcilable opposites without destroying either pole. Your simultaneous experience of numbness and heightened awareness may be this function awakening within you, teaching you to inhabit the liminal space where transformation becomes possible. Most of consciousness lives in the realm of either/or. Either you are happy or sad, strong or weak, rational or emotional, connected or isolated. The ordinary mind seeks resolution, demands clarity, insists on choosing sides in the great conflicts that define human existence. But there exists within the psyche a more sophisticated intelligence, one that can hold paradox without anxiety, contain contradiction without collapse, embrace the both and nature of existence that the rational mind finds so unsettling. This is the transcendent function at work. Not transcendent in the sense of rising above human experience, but transcendent in its capacity to bridge what seems unbridgeable, to find the third way that honors both sides of psychological opposition, while being limited by neither. It is the psyche's own wisdom tradition, its native capacity for what the mystics called coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites that reveals a deeper unity underlying apparent division. When you experience numbness alongside acute awareness, you are being initiated into this more complex form of consciousness. The numbness represents the ego's attempt to maintain stability in the face of overwhelming input. The awareness represents the psyche's insistence on growth, its refusal to remain unconscious even when consciousness brings discomfort. Neither response is wrong. Both serve essential functions in the economy of psychological development. The transcendent function asks you to resist the temptation to resolve this tension prematurely. Instead of asking, how can I stop being numb, or how can I stop being so aware, the deeper question becomes, how can I learn to hold both experiences without being destroyed by their apparent contradiction? This shift in questioning opens entirely new possibilities for engagement with your psychological material. Consider the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, representing the eternal cycle of destruction and creation, ending and beginning. At first glance, this appears to be an image of futility. The serpent destroys itself in the very act of nourishing itself. But looked at more deeply, the Ouroboros represents the transcendent function in mythic form, the capacity to contain apparently contradictory processes within a single movement, to find life-giving meaning in what appears to be meaningless repetition. Your psychological experience may mirror this ancient wisdom. The very numbness that seems to cut you off from life may be creating space for a new form of aliveness to emerge. The awareness that brings distress may simultaneously be preparing you for a deeper form of peace. The apparent contradiction between feeling nothing and perceiving everything may be the tension necessary to birth a third way of being that transcends both emotional overwhelm and emotional shutdown. This third way cannot be thought into existence. It must be lived into being. The transcendent function operates not through intellectual understanding, but through what Jung called active imagination, the conscious engagement with unconscious contents in a way that allows new possibilities to emerge from their interaction. This is not fantasy or wishful thinking, but a disciplined practice of paying attention to the space between opposites, learning to recognize the creative potential that exists in psychological tension. When you notice yourself caught between numbness and hypersensitivity, you might begin to ask different questions. Instead of, which of these is the real me, you might wonder, what is trying to be born from the marriage of these opposites? Instead of, how can I get rid of this contradiction? You might inquire, what is this tension teaching me about the complexity of human consciousness? These questions invite you into relationship with your psychological material, rather than seeking to overcome or resolve it. They acknowledge that the psyche's apparent contradictions may not be problems to solve, but paradoxes to inhabit, koans designed to expand consciousness beyond the limitations of linear thinking. The transcendent function often manifests first as a capacity to witness internal conflict without immediately taking sides. You learn to observe the part of you that wants to shut down alongside the part that cannot stop feeling, to notice the voice demanding certainty while honoring the I, wisdom that embraces mystery. This witnessing is not detached observation, but engaged presence. You remain fully involved in your experience while simultaneously maintaining enough perspective to see the larger pattern of which each element is a part. This developing capacity for conscious paradox begins to transform your relationship not only to internal experience, but to external relationships and circumstances. You become less invested in being right and more interested in being whole. You discover that you can love someone while acknowledging their limitations, commit yourself to causes while maintaining flexibility about methods, hold strong convictions while remaining open to new information. The transcendent function reveals that many of the conflicts that seem to require choosing sides are actually invitations to develop greater psychological sophistication. The tension between independence and intimacy, for instance, may not require you to choose between being autonomous or connected, but rather to discover ways of being that honor both needs simultaneously. The apparent opposition between spiritual seeking and worldly engagement may resolve not through choosing one over the other, but through finding forms of engagement that serve both spiritual development and practical effectiveness. This is particularly relevant to the numbness awareness paradox you may be experiencing. Rather than viewing these as incompatible states requiring resolution, the transcendent function suggests they may be complementary aspects of a more complex form of consciousness trying to emerge. The numbness may provide the stability necessary to contain intense awareness without being overwhelmed. The awareness may provide the sensitivity necessary to prevent numbness from becoming permanent disconnection. Jung observed that the transcendent function often emerges most clearly during periods of psychological crisis or transition, times when the old ways of organizing experience no longer work, but new forms have not yet crystallized. This liminal space, uncomfortable as it may be, is the natural habitat of transformation. It is here that consciousness develops the flexibility to engage with apparently contradictory energies without being torn apart by their tension. Your experience of simultaneous numbness and awareness may indicate that you are in such a transitional space, being prepared for a more sophisticated form of consciousness that can navigate complexity without demanding simplification. This is not easy work. It requires developing what the Zen tradition calls don't-know mind, the willingness to remain present with uncertainty, to function effectively while acknowledging the limits of understanding. The transcendent function asks you to become comfortable with not knowing which aspect of your experience is true or real. Both the numbness and the awareness are real. Both serve functions in the larger economy of psychological development. The question is not which one to choose, but how to learn from their interaction, how to allow their apparent opposition to generate something new rather than demanding that one overcome the other. This process requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to internal contradiction. Instead of experiencing conflicting impulses as evidence of confusion or pathology, you begin to recognize them as the raw material of psychological evolution. The tension between opposing forces becomes not a problem to solve, but energy to harness. Not chaos to overcome, but complexity to navigate with growing skill. The development of the transcendent function is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice. Each time you encounter apparently irreconcilable opposites within yourself or in your circumstances, you have an opportunity to strengthen this capacity. Each moment of choosing to hold tension rather than resolve it prematurely contributes to the development of consciousness that can engage with paradox as a natural aspect of existence, rather than an uncomfortable exception. This practice transforms not only how you handle internal conflicts, but how you engage with the broader contradictions of human existence. You become more capable of holding the tension between hope and realism, between accepting what is and working for change, between honoring tradition and embracing innovation. You develop what we might call paradoxical thinking, not the ability to believe contradictory things simultaneously, but the capacity to engage constructively with the both and nature of reality. The transcendent function also reveals that many experiences we label as problems may actually be signs of psychological sophistication trying to emerge. The capacity to feel numbness and awareness simultaneously suggests that consciousness is developing the complexity necessary to engage with the full spectrum of human experience, rather than being limited to either emotional availability or protective shutdown. You are developing the ability to modulate your engagement consciously, to be present with intensity when appropriate, and to create space when necessary. This conscious modulation is very different from either unconscious numbing or uncontrolled emotional reactivity. It represents a mature response to the reality that human consciousness must be capable of both extraordinary sensitivity and protective resilience. The transcendent function allows you to access both capacities as circumstances require, rather than being stuck in either extreme. The development of this flexibility often involves what Jung called the constellation of the self, the activation of the archetypal center that orchestrates psychological wholeness. The self, unlike the ego, is large enough to contain contradictions without being destabilized by them. It recognizes that human beings are necessarily paradoxical creatures, capable of wisdom and foolishness, love and hatred, creation and destruction, often within the same moment. When the self begins to emerge as the organizing principle of consciousness, you find that you can acknowledge the full range of your human complexity without being overwhelmed by it. You can own your capacity for both generosity and selfishness, both courage and fear, both clarity and confusion, recognizing that psychological health lies not in eliminating unwanted aspects, but in conscious relationship with the totality of what you are. This relationship with psychological totality transforms the experience of internal conflict from battlefield to dance floor. The opposing forces within you learn to move together rather than fighting for dominance. Your numbness and your awareness begin to complement rather than contradict each other, creating a more nuanced and flexible approach to engagement with life. The transcendent function also reveals itself in the realm of relationship with others. As you become more capable of holding internal paradox, you become more capable of accepting the paradoxical nature of others. You can love someone while acknowledging their shadow, commit to relationships while honoring the need for individual growth, offer support while respecting others' autonomy. This capacity for paradoxical relating often deepens intimacy in unexpected ways. When you no longer need others to be only one thing, only supportive, only consistent, only available, you create space for them to be fully human. This acceptance of complexity in others mirrors and reinforces your growing acceptance of complexity in yourself. The practice of the transcendent function gradually reveals that many of the either-or choices that seem to define human existence are actually invitations to develop both and consciousness. Rather than choosing between thinking and feeling, You learn to think feelingly and feel thoughtfully. Rather than choosing between solitude and relationship, you discover forms of togetherness that honor individual integrity and forms of aloneness that maintain connection to others. Your simultaneous numbness and awareness may be preparing you for precisely this kind of sophisticated consciousness. The numbness teaches you that you can maintain stability even in the face of overwhelming input. The awareness teaches you that you can remain sensitive even when protection is necessary. Together, they are schooling you in the art of conscious modulation, the ability to be appropriately responsive to whatever life presents. This learning often unfolds through what seems like contradiction and confusion. You find yourself simultaneously caring deeply and feeling detached, being acutely aware of others' pain while maintaining enough distance to respond helpfully rather than reactively. These apparently contradictory responses may actually be evidence of the transcendent function developing within you, creating space for more nuanced and effective engagement with the complexities of existence. The ultimate gift of the transcendent function is that it reveals the fundamental both and nature of existence itself. Reality is simultaneously meaningful and absurd, beautiful and terrible, orderly and chaotic. Human beings are simultaneously individual and collective, separate and connected, temporal and eternal. Consciousness itself is simultaneously personal and transpersonal, bounded and boundless, particular and universal. When you develop the capacity to hold these paradoxes consciously, you discover that you are no longer at war with reality, but in creative partnership with it. The contradictions that once created anxiety become sources of energy. The tensions that once demanded resolution become invitations to develop greater psychological sophistication. The either-or choices that once seemed to define your options reveal themselves as opportunities to discover third ways that honor multiple truths simultaneously. Your experience of numbness alongside heightened awareness, strange and uncomfortable, as it may sometimes be, may be consciousness preparing you for this more complex engagement with existence. Rather than a problem to overcome, it may be a capacity to develop, the ability to remain present with the full spectrum of human experience without being destroyed by its intensity or complexity. In learning to navigate this paradox consciously, you join the ranks of those who have discovered that psychological maturity lies not in the elimination of contradiction, but in the conscious integration of opposing forces. You become capable of what the mystics called dynamic stillness, the ability to remain centered while fully engaged, peaceful while passionate, wise while continuing to learn. This is the promise of the transcendent function, not the resolution of all conflicts, but the development of consciousness sophisticated enough to dance with contradiction, to find creativity in tension, to discover in the space between opposites not emptiness, but infinite possibility. There comes a moment in the depths of numbness when you realize that you are not alone in the cavern of your inner life. Something moves in the shadows beyond the reach of conscious thought, something that has been trying to speak to you through the static of your rational mind. Jung discovered what the mystics and shamans had always known, that the psyche is populated by autonomous figures, living symbols that carry the wisdom your ego has forgotten. Active imagination is the sacred art of learning to converse with these inner inhabitants, not as flights of fancy, but as encounters with the deeper intelligence that orchestrates your becoming. When numbness settles like fog across the landscape of your inner world, these figures often grow restless, pressing against the boundaries of awareness like characters in a dream trying to break through into waking consciousness. They speak in the language of symbol and metaphor, in images that bypass the rationale, mind's defenses, and touch something more ancient, more essential. The wise old man appears as a figure of guidance, carrying the accumulated wisdom your ego has rejected. The shadow emerges as the disowned aspects of self, the parts you've banished, to the darkness but which hold vital energy for your wholeness. The anima or animus rises as the soul image, the bridge between conscious and unconscious, the inner other who knows the secrets of your deepest longing. But the rational mind, trained in the harsh mathematics of survival, dismisses these figures as mere fantasy, products of an undisciplined imagination. It builds walls of skepticism and logic, convinced that reality exists only in what can be measured, categorized, and controlled. This is the great tragedy of modern consciousness. We have learned to silence the very voices that could guide us home to ourselves. We mistake the ego's narrow beam of awareness for the totality of what we are, forgetting that beneath the surface of rational thought flows the vast river of the unconscious, carrying treasures and terrors in equal measure. Active imagination requires a kind of conscious dreaming, a deliberate descent into the realm where psyche speaks in its native tongue of image and symbol. You must learn to relax the iron grip of rational control without falling into passive absorption. This is the middle way Jung discovered, neither the rigidity of purely intellectual analysis nor the dissolution of uncritical fantasy, but a conscious participation in the unconscious process. You become both observer and participant, witness and actor in the drama of your own transformation. The practice begins with creating sacred space, a time and place where the usual rules of rational discourse are suspended. You might sit in meditation, walk in nature, or simply close your eyes and allow the mind to soften its focus. The key is to cultivate what Jung called a certain receptive attitude, open enough to receive what emerges, strong enough to engage with it consciously. You learn to watch the screen of inner vision with the same attention you might give to a profound dream, knowing that whatever appears carries meaning beyond its surface form. Often the first figure to emerge is the one you most need to meet. If you have been running from your shadow, the shadow will step forward with its rough wisdom and uncomfortable truths. If you have been disconnected from your instinctual nature, the animal figures may appear, wolves, serpents, birds of prey, carrying the wild energy your civilized persona has rejected. If you have been seeking guidance, the wise old man or woman may emerge from the depths, sometimes in forms borrowed from your cultural heritage, sometimes in entirely personal symbols that speak directly to your soul's condition. The art lies in learning to dialogue with these figures as you would with living beings, because in the psychological sense, they are living beings. They possess their own autonomy, their own perspective, their own agenda. They are not puppets of your conscious will, but autonomous aspects of the total personality, fragments of the self that have been waiting in the wings for their moment, to contribute to the greater symphony of your becoming. When you learn to address them directly, to ask them questions and listen for their responses, you discover that they have been trying to communicate with you all along. The shadow figure, when you finally turn to face it, rarely appears as the monster your ego fears. More often it presents itself as the rejected child, the abandoned artist, the silenced rebel, the unlived life that carries the energy you need for renewal. Why have you ignored me? It might ask. What gift am I trying to bring you? The dialogue that unfolds can be shocking in its honesty, its directness, its refusal to accept the comfortable lies the ego tells itself. But within this confrontation lies the possibility of reclaiming vital aspects of yourself that have been exiled to the darkness. The anima or animus, when approached with genuine curiosity, reveals itself as the soul's own voice, speaking truths that the rational mind cannot grasp. It may appear as a figure from a dream, a character from literature, or an entirely personal image that embodies your deepest sense of meaning and connection. Its language is often cryptic, poetic, challenging the linear thinking that dominates conscious life. You have been living on the surface, it might say. Come deeper. Come home to the mystery you truly are. These dialogues can be profoundly moving, touching places in the psyche that have been starved for authentic contact. The wise old man or woman carries the archetypal wisdom that transcends personal experience. This figure often appears when you are facing decisions or transitions that require more than rational analysis. It speaks from a perspective that encompasses both the personal and the transpersonal, offering guidance that honors both your individual path and your connection to the greater patterns of human experience. The wisdom it offers is not abstract philosophy, but lived understanding, practical insight, clothed in metaphorical language that your soul recognizes even when your mind struggles to comprehend. But active imagination is not a passive reception of inner voices. It requires the conscious ego to remain present and engaged, to ask questions, to challenge, to seek clarification. You are not surrendering your critical faculties, but expanding them to include forms of knowing that rational thought alone cannot access. You learn to distinguish between genuine psychological material and mere wishful thinking, between the authentic voice of the unconscious and the echo chamber of ego-driven fantasy. The dialogue that emerges through active imagination often has a quality that surprises the rational mind. The figures speak with their own voice, offer perspectives you had not considered, challenge your assumptions in ways that feel both foreign and deeply familiar. They possess what Jung called a knowledge and purposiveness that extends beyond the ego's limited perspective. They seem to know things about your situation, your history, your potential that you yourself had not consciously recognized. This is because these figures are not created by the ego, but emerge from deeper layers of the psyche where personal and collective wisdom intersect. They carry not only your individual psychological content, but archetypal patterns that connect you to the broader human experience. The shadow that emerges in active imagination carries not only your personal rejected aspects, but the shadow of humanity itself, the darkness that every generation must confront and integrate. The wise figure that appears carries not only your personal wisdom, but the accumulated insight of countless generations who have walked similar paths of awakening. Through sustained practice of active imagination, you begin to develop what Jung called a feeling for the archetypes, a sensitivity to the deeper patterns that shape human experience. You recognize these figures not as external deities or demons, but as aspects of your own psychological structure, personifications of functions and potentials that seek expression through your individual life. The dialogue becomes a form of internal democracy, a conscious collaboration between different aspects of the total personality. This process is particularly powerful for those experiencing numbness because it provides a direct channel of communication with the parts of the psyche that hold emotional vitality. Often what feels like emptiness is actually a disconnection from these inner figures who carry the passion, creativity, and life force that the rational ego has learned to suppress. Through active imagination, you can ask directly, where has my feeling gone? What needs to be expressed? What have I been afraid to face? The answers that emerge can be startling in their clarity and relevance. The shadow figure, when given voice, often reveals that it holds not only your darkness, but your unlived potential. I am the artist you abandoned, it might say. I am the lover you rejected. I am the rebel whose fire you tried to extinguish. The dialogue that follows can lead to a profound reclaiming of disowned aspects of self. A recognition that what you feared as destructive may actually be the very energy you need for renewal and growth. The anima or animus, when approached through active imagination, often serves as a bridge to the deeper layers of the unconscious. It may guide you toward understanding the spiritual dimensions of your numbness, revealing it not as pathology, but as a call to deeper meaning. Your emptiness is sacred, it might whisper. It is the void from which new life emerges. Do not fill it too quickly with distractions. Learn to rest in the pregnant darkness and listen to what wants to be born. But active imagination is not always comfortable or reassuring. The figures that emerge may challenge your self-image, confront You with difficult truths demand changes you are reluctant to make. The wise old man might speak harshly of your compromises and evasions. The shadow might reveal aspects of yourself that you would prefer to keep hidden. The anima or animus might demand a level of authenticity that feels dangerous to your carefully constructed persona. This is where the practice becomes most valuable and most demanding. Active imagination requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to face whatever emerges without immediately judging, suppressing, or rationalizing it away. You must learn to hold space for uncomfortable truths, to engage with aspects of yourself that your ego finds threatening or embarrassing. This is not masochistic self-torture, but the necessary work of psychological integration, the gradual process of becoming whole rather than merely good. The figures that emerge in active imagination often carry compensatory messages, perspectives that balance the one-sided attitudes of conscious life. If you have been overly rational, they may speak the language of feeling and intuition. If you have been passive and accommodating, they may embody fierce assertiveness. If you have been disconnected from your body and instincts, they may appear as animal figures calling you back to your primal nature. This compensatory function serves the psyche's drive toward balance and wholeness. Over time, the practice of active imagination begins to change your relationship to the unconscious itself. Instead of seeing it as a chaotic repository of primitive impulses and forgotten memories, you begin to recognize it as a source of wisdom, creativity, and renewal. The figures that emerge become familiar companions on the journey of self-discovery, trusted advisors who offer perspectives that complement and challenge the ego's limited viewpoint. This shift has profound implications for how you experience numbness and disconnection. Instead of seeing these states as purely negative conditions to be overcome, you begin to recognize them as invitations to deeper dialogue with yourself. The emptiness becomes sacred space where inner figures can emerge without the usual noise of mental activity. The silence becomes not absence but pregnant potential, the womb of new psychological life. Jung understood that active imagination was not merely a therapeutic technique, but a form of prayer, a way of communing with the deeper mystery of what we are. Through sustained dialogue with the unconscious, you begin to experience yourself as more than the narrow beam of ego consciousness, more than the roles and identities that define your social existence. You touch what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness that orchestrates the process of individuation from depths beyond rational understanding. The religious dimensions of active imagination become apparent as the practice deepens. You are not simply talking to yourself, but engaging with transpersonal dimensions of the psyche that connect you to something greater than your individual existence. The figures that emerge often carry numinous quality, a sense of sacred presence that transforms the very space in which the dialogue occurs. You begin to understand why Jung spoke of the unconscious as having its own religious function, its own orientation toward transcendence and meaning. This is particularly relevant for those experiencing the spiritual desert of modern numbness. Active imagination provides a direct path to encounter the sacred within your own psychological structure, to discover that the divine is not absent from your experience, but hidden in the depths, waiting to be approached with the proper attitude of openness and respect. The figures that emerge carry the wisdom of ages, the accumulated insight of human encounter with mystery, the living symbols that connect individual experience to universal patterns of meaning. But the practice demands patience and persistence. The rational mind, trained to seek immediate answers and concrete solutions, may grow frustrated with the indirect symbolic communication of the unconscious. You must learn to appreciate the language of metaphor and image, to value insight that comes not as clear instruction, but as poetic revelation that unfolds its meaning gradually over time. The figures may speak in riddles, appear in dreams, communicate through synchronicities that bridge inner and outer worlds, The integration of insights from active imagination into daily life becomes its own art. The wisdom received in dialogue with inner figures must be translated into practical action, conscious choice, lived reality. The shadow's gift of vitality must be channeled constructively. The anima's call to authenticity must be embodied in real relationships and creative expression. The wise figure's guidance must inform actual decisions and life direction. This integration process requires ongoing attention and commitment, the willingness to let inner work transform outer circumstances. Active imagination also reveals the essentially creative nature of the psyche itself. The figures that emerge are not preset recordings, but living symbols that adapt to your changing circumstances and developmental needs. They grow and evolve as you do, offering new perspectives as old conflicts resolve and new challenges emerge. This ongoing creativity of the unconscious speaks to the fundamental aliveness of the psyche, its capacity for renewal and regeneration, even in the midst of apparent stagnation. The practice becomes particularly powerful when approached as a form of sacred dialogue, a conscious participation in the mystery of psychological transformation. You learn to create ritual space for these encounters, to approach them with the reverence they deserve, to receive their gifts with gratitude and humility. The numbness that once felt like spiritual death begins to reveal itself as preparation for rebirth, the emptying that must precede new fullness. Through sustained engagement with active imagination, you begin to experience what Jung called a transcendent function, a bridge between conscious and unconscious that enables genuine psychological transformation. The rigid patterns that maintain numbness begin to soften as new possibilities emerge from the dialogue between different aspects of the total personality. You discover that healing comes not through elimination of symptoms, but through integration of previously unconscious content, through learning to dance consciously with all the figures that populate your inner world. This dance of consciousness and unconscious, of ego and shadow, of personal will and archetypal wisdom, becomes the ongoing work of individuation. Active imagination provides the forum where this dance can be conducted consciously, where the various aspects of self can meet in dialogue rather than conflict. The numbness that once seemed like a dead end begins to reveal itself as a crossroads, a place where old patterns dissolve and new configurations of self become possible. The ultimate gift of active imagination is the recognition that you are not alone in your journey toward wholeness. The figures that emerge from the unconscious are not foreign invaders, but aspects of your own deeper nature, allies in the work of becoming who you truly are. They carry the wisdom you need for your healing, the energy you need for your growth, the guidance you need for your unique path of individuation. Learning to dialogue with them consciously transforms the entire landscape of inner life, replacing the monologue of ego with the rich chorus of the total personality seeking expression and integration. In this sacred conversation between conscious and unconscious, between known and unknown aspects of self, the seeds of genuine transformation are planted. The numbness that once felt like death begins to reveal itself as the pregnant void from which new life emerges. Through the ancient art of active imagination adapted for contemporary consciousness, you discover that healing is not something that happens to you, but something you participate in consciously, a collaborative creation between all the aspects of your being that seek wholeness and authentic expression. Deep within the architecture of human consciousness lies a function that modernity has nearly forgotten, but which Jung recognized as essential to psychological health: the religious function of the psyche. This is not religion as doctrine or institution, but the soul's innate orientation toward the sacred, its natural hunger for meaning that transcends the material boundaries of existence. Your numbness may be the soul's quiet rebellion against a world that has forgotten the numinous, against a culture that reduces the miracle of consciousness to mere neural firing and reduces your infinite complexity to economic productivity and social utility. When Jung spoke of the religious function, he was pointing to something primordial in human nature, an instinctual drive toward transcendence that operates as naturally as the drive for food or shelter or love. This function seeks not belief but direct experience, not dogma but living encounter with the mystery that consciousness represents in an otherwise unconscious cosmos. It is the part of you that knows, without rational proof, that you are more than the sum of your biological processes, more than the roles society assigns you, more than the narrative your ego constructs to maintain its fragile sense of control. The numbness that settles over contemporary life often carries within it a profound spiritual homesickness, the soul's longing for connection to something greater than the narrow confines of personal existence. In a culture that has systematically eliminated the sacred from daily experience, that has reduced wonder to scientific explanation and meaning to market value, the religious function of the psyche becomes like a sense organ deprived of its proper nourishment. It begins to atrophy, leaving behind a peculiar emptiness that no amount of material success or social achievement can fill. This spiritual starvation manifests not as dramatic crisis, but as a subtle graying of experience, a flattening of the emotional landscape that leaves you going through the motions of living without feeling deeply connected to the mystery of being alive. You wake each morning to the same routines, pursue the same goals, interact with the same superficial level of engagement, all while something deeper in you grows increasingly restless and dissatisfied. The world becomes disenchanted, drained of the magical quality that children naturally perceive and that mystics spend lifetimes trying to recapture. Jung understood that this disenchantment was not evolution, but devolution, a regression from the natural human capacity to perceive meaning and sacredness in the fabric of existence itself. The religious function, when healthy and active, transforms ordinary experience into revelation, mundane moments into occasions of wonder, personal struggles into participation in the universal drama of becoming. Without this function, life loses its depth dimension, its connection to the timeless patterns that give individual existence its larger significance. The religious function operates through what Jung called the numinous experience, moments when ordinary consciousness is touched by something that feels both utterly foreign and deeply familiar, both transcendent and intimately personal. These are not necessarily dramatic mystical experiences, though they can be. More often, they are quiet recognitions of meaning that arise spontaneously, the sudden awareness of your connection to the natural world while watching a sunrise, the profound sense of being held by something greater during times of loss or transition, the inexplicable knowing that emerges in moments of creative breakthrough or deep love. These numinous moments serve as food for the religious function, evidence that consciousness itself is shot through with mystery, that the boundary between inner and outer worlds is far more permeable than rational thought assumes. They remind you that you exist within a living cosmos, not a dead mechanism, that your individual awareness is a unique aperture through which the universe becomes conscious of itself. This recognition carries with it a sense of both profound responsibility and infinite possibility. You are not merely a consumer of experiences, but a co-creator in the ongoing emergence of meaning. But contemporary culture has become remarkably efficient at explaining away these numinous moments, reducing them to brain chemistry, evolutionary adaptations, or psychological projections. The rational mind, trained in the methodology of scientific materialism, dismisses as illusion anything that cannot be measured, replicated, or controlled. This reductionist approach, while valuable within its proper domain, becomes destructive when applied to the religious function, which operates in dimensions of experience that transcend the reach of purely rational analysis. The result is a kind of spiritual anemia that shows up as numbness, meaninglessness, and a pervasive sense of disconnection from the deeper currents of life. The religious function, deprived of recognition and nourishment, begins to operate unconsciously, seeking fulfillment through substitute channels that can never fully satisfy its need for genuine transcendence. Political ideologies become substitute religions, complete with their own orthodoxies and heresies. Consumer culture promises transcendence through acquisition, offering endless products that claim to fulfill the deep longing that only spiritual experience can address. Even psychological and therapeutic approaches can become substitute spiritualities when they promise complete healing through technique while ignoring the soul's need for meaning that extends beyond personal wellness. Jung recognized that the crisis of modern consciousness was fundamentally religious in nature, not a problem to be solved through better theology, but a drought of the soul that could only be addressed through renewed contact with the numinous dimensions of experience. He saw that the old religious forms, while containing profound wisdom, had become too rigid and literalistic for many contemporary souls. Yet the need they addressed remained as urgent as ever. What was required was not the abandonment of religion, but its renewal through direct psychological experience, through individual encounter with the sacred that bypassed institutional mediation. The religious function, when consciously engaged, transforms your relationship to suffering itself. Instead of viewing difficult experiences as meaningless obstacles to be overcome as quickly as possible, you begin to recognize them as initiations, opportunities for deepening and growth that connect you to the universal human experience of transformation through ordeal. The numbness you may be experiencing is not simply a symptom to be eliminated, but a dark night of the soul, a necessary stripping away of superficial attachments that precedes genuine spiritual renewal. This reframing of suffering requires what Jung called a religious attitude, not belief in specific doctrines, but openness to the possibility that your personal struggles participate in larger patterns of meaning, that your individual journey of healing and growth serves purposes that extend beyond your personal comfort and success. This attitude allows you to approach your own psychological symptoms with curiosity rather than mere resistance, to ask not only, how can I feel better, but what is trying to emerge through this difficulty? What is my suffering trying to teach me? How does my individual healing serve the larger healing of the world? The religious function also awakens what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to bridge opposites, to find creative solutions that honor competing truths without collapsing into either-or thinking. This function becomes particularly important when dealing with the paradoxes that spiritual awakening inevitably presents. How do you honor both your individual needs and your connection to the whole? How do you embrace both acceptance and the drive for positive change? How do you hold both the reality of suffering and the possibility of joy? These paradoxes cannot be resolved through rational analysis alone, but require a different kind of knowing, one that emerges from sustained engagement with the mystery of existence itself. The religious function provides access to this knowing, allowing you to hold contradictions in creative tension, rather than collapsing prematurely into false resolutions. This capacity becomes essential for navigating the complexities of authentic, spiritual life, which rarely offers the clear-cut answers that rational thought demands. The awakening of the religious function also transforms your relationship to time itself. Instead of experiencing life as a linear progression from birth to death punctuated by achievements and failures, you begin to sense your participation in cyclical patterns that connect you to the eternal dimension of existence. Your personal story becomes embedded in the larger story of consciousness evolving through individual forms, each life a unique experiment in awareness, each death and rebirth, whether literal or metaphorical, part of an infinite dance of becoming. This expanded, temporal perspective offers profound comfort to souls suffering from the existential anxiety that underlies much contemporary numbness. The fear of meaninglessness that haunts modern consciousness begins to dissolve when you recognize your individual existence as a precious but temporary flowering of something eternal and indestructible. You are not merely a brief accident in an indifferent universe, but a unique expression of the universe's own drive toward consciousness, creativity, and love. Jung understood that this recognition could not be forced or manufactured through belief alone, but had to arise through direct experience, through moments when the boundary between self and cosmos becomes transparent, and you glimpse the fundamental unity that underlies apparent separation. These moments of religious experience validate themselves. They carry a quality of absolute conviction that needs no external confirmation. You know them not through faith, but through immediate recognition, the way you know the taste of water or the feeling of your own breath. But such experiences, while transformative, are typically brief and cannot be sustained through effort alone. The religious function requires ongoing cultivation through practices that keep you open to the numinous dimension of existence. This might involve meditation, prayer, creative expression, time in nature, service to others, or simply maintaining an attitude of reverent attention to the ordinary miraculous moments that fill every day. The specific form matters less than the underlying intention to remain available to mystery, to resist the rational mind's tendency to explain away the inexplicable. The religious function also awakens what Jung called the God image, an archetypal pattern within the psyche that serves as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal, finite and infinite. This image is not a concept or belief, but a living symbol that evolves throughout your life, reflecting your deepening understanding of the sacred dimension of existence. For some, it may take traditional religious forms, while for others it might manifest as the self, the Tao, the ground of being, or simply as an unnamed presence that seems to guide and sustain consciousness itself. This God image serves as an organizing principle within the psyche, providing a center around which the various aspects of personality can arrange themselves in meaningful relationship. It offers what Jung called a unifying symbol that helps integrate the competing drives, desires, and potentials that constitute human nature. Without such a center, consciousness tends to fragment into conflicting subsystems, each pursuing its own agenda without regard for the welfare of the whole. The numbness that characterizes much contemporary experience often reflects this fragmentation. The absence of any unifying principle strong enough to organize the complexity of modern life into coherent meaning. The religious function, when active, provides this organizing principle not as external authority, but as inner recognition of the sacred dimension that permeates all existence. This recognition transforms how you relate to everything from daily routines to major life decisions, infusing ordinary activities with a sense of participation in something infinitely meaningful. Jung also recognized that the religious function has both personal and collective dimensions. Your individual's spiritual development does not occur in isolation, but participates in the collective evolution of consciousness itself. The insights you gain through personal spiritual work contribute to the larger pool of human wisdom, while the spiritual achievements of others become available to support your own journey. You are both student and teacher in the great university of consciousness, exploring itself through countless individual perspectives. This collective dimension adds another layer of meaning to personal spiritual experience. Your struggles with meaninglessness and numbness are not merely personal pathology, but symptoms of a larger spiritual crisis that affects contemporary civilization as a whole. Your individual healing becomes a contribution to the healing of the world, your personal awakening a small but significant step in the evolution of human consciousness toward greater wisdom, compassion, and integration. The religious function also transforms your relationship to death, both the literal death that awaits every physical form and the many symbolic deaths that mark the stages of psychological development. Instead of experiencing death as absolute termination, you begin to recognize it as transformation, as the dissolution of one form of consciousness that allows for the emergence of another. This recognition does not eliminate the grief and fear that naturally accompany loss, but it places these emotions within a larger context that allows for acceptance alongside sorrow. Your own numbness, viewed from this perspective, may be understood as a form of death. The death of old patterns of meaning that no longer serve your growth. The dissolution of false identities that have kept you separated from your authentic nature. The emptiness you experience is not void but fertile ground, not absence but pregnant potential awaiting the right conditions for new growth. The religious function provides the patience and faith necessary to endure such deaths without premature resurrection, trusting that the darkness serves an essential purpose in the cycle of spiritual development. But the awakening of the religious function also brings its own challenges and temptations. The experiences it provides can become sources of spiritual pride, leading to inflation rather than genuine humility. The certainty that accompanies numinous experience can harden into dogmatism that closes off further growth. The sense of being specially chosen or enlightened can create separation from others rather than deeper compassion and connection. Jung was acutely aware of these dangers and emphasized the importance of what he called the religious attitude as opposed to religious experience per se. This attitude involves maintaining openness to mystery while avoiding premature closure, embracing the gifts of spiritual insight while remaining grounded in ordinary human reality, accepting the authority of inner experience while retaining critical judgment about its interpretation and application. The religious function, when mature and integrated, leads not to escape from human limitations, but to their conscious acceptance and transformation. You do not transcend your humanity, but discover its sacred dimension, not overcome your individual nature, but recognize it as a unique expression of universal consciousness. This integration allows you to live simultaneously as a particular person with specific needs and limitations, and as an expression of something infinite and eternal. This paradoxical existence, fully human and fully connected to the transcendent, represents the goal toward which the religious function naturally moves. You learn to find the eternal within the temporal, the infinite within the finite, the sacred within the ordinary. Every moment becomes potentially revelatory, every encounter an opportunity for deeper recognition of the mystery that animates all existence. The numbness that may have brought you to this exploration begins to reveal itself as the soul's way of creating space for this deeper recognition. Like the dark phase of the moon that precedes the new light, your emptiness creates the silence necessary for hearing the subtle voice of the sacred speaking through the midst of ordinary experience. The religious function, once awakened, transforms this silence from absence into presence, from void into fullness, from death into the eternal renewal that is consciousness itself, discovering its own infinite nature through the unique aperture of your individual awareness. This transformation does not happen overnight, but unfolds gradually as you learn to trust the wisdom of your own spiritual instincts, to honor the numinous experiences that arise spontaneously, to create space in your life for mystery and wonder. The religious function, like any psychological function, strengthens through conscious use and attention. The more you recognize and value its operations, the more available it becomes as a source of meaning, guidance, and renewal in your daily life. Through the awakening of this function, you discover that spirituality is not something you add to your life, but something you uncover within it, not an escape from human existence, but its deepest dimension, not a belief system you adopt, but a recognition of what you have always been. Consciousness itself, playing at being individual for a brief cosmic moment, then awakening to remember its eternal nature while still embracing the precious gift of temporary form. The journey from numbness through awareness to wholeness is not a straight path with a clear destination, but a spiral that returns us again and again to ourselves, each time with deeper understanding, each revolution carrying us closer to the center of what we truly are. Jung's final and perhaps most profound insight was that the goal of psychological development is not the elimination of suffering, but its conscious integration, not the escape from the human condition, but its full embrace. When the fragments of self that have been scattered through years of adaptation and survival begin to gather themselves into coherent wholeness, you discover that what felt like emptiness was actually pregnant void, the sacred space from which new life emerges. This return to wholeness is what Jung called the ultimate goal of individuation, not perfection in the sense of flawless functioning, but completion in the sense of nothing essential being left out. Every aspect of your nature, every rejected part of yourself, every unlived potential finds its proper place in the symphony of the total personality. The shadow is not eliminated but integrated, its dark energy transformed into creative power. The persona is not destroyed but made conscious, its social functions serving authentic self-expression rather than mere conformity. The anima or animus is not overcome but embraced, its bridge-building function connecting conscious and unconscious in ongoing dialogue. This integration does not happen through will or effort alone, but through what Jung recognized as the natural healing tendency of the psyche itself, its innate drive toward balance, wholeness, and self-realization. Like a river that naturally flows toward the sea, consciousness naturally moves toward integration when the obstacles to its flow are gradually removed. Your task is not to force this process, but to cooperate with it, to recognize and remove the dams of resistance, judgment, and fear that block the natural current of becoming. The numbness that may have initiated your journey begins to reveal its deeper purpose as this integration unfolds. What seemed like pathology was actually protection, the psyche's way of creating necessary distance from overwhelming experiences until you develop the strength to face them consciously. What felt like disconnection was actually preparation, the emptying out of false identities and superficial attachments to make space for more authentic ways of being. What appeared to be spiritual death was actually gestation, the dark, enclosed period of transformation that precedes emergence into new life. This recognition transforms your entire relationship to difficulty and challenge. Instead of seeing symptoms as enemies to be conquered, you begin to understand them as messengers carrying information about what needs attention, healing, or integration. The anxiety that once felt like pure torment reveals itself as the voice of unlived potential, seeking expression. The depression that seemed like absolute darkness shows its face as the soul's demand for greater depth and authenticity. The confusion that felt like mental chaos becomes recognized as the natural disorientation that accompanies any genuine transformation. Enantiodromia, the psyche's tendency to convert into its opposite, becomes not just a theoretical concept, but a lived reality. From the depths of numbness comes exquisite sensitivity. From the experience of meaninglessness emerges profound purpose. From the darkness of despair is born radiant joy. But these opposites do not simply replace each other in linear succession. They become integrated into a paradoxical unity that can hold contradictions without breaking, that can embrace both suffering and joy, both limitation and transcendence, both human frailty and divine possibility. This capacity to hold opposites consciously represents a fundamental shift in the structure of consciousness itself. The either-or thinking that characterizes ego consciousness gives way to both and awareness that can appreciate complexity, nuance, and paradox. You no longer need to be either strong or vulnerable, either independent or connected, either rational or intuitive. You can be strong enough to be vulnerable, independent enough to be truly intimate, rational enough to trust intuitive wisdom. This integration of opposites creates what Jung called the transcendent function, a new level of consciousness that emerges from the creative tension between contradictory aspects of experience. The return to wholeness also involves a profound shift in your relationship to time and personal history. The linear narrative of progress and regress, success and failure, gives way to a cyclical understanding that recognizes the eternal patterns underlying temporal existence. Your personal story becomes embedded in the larger story of consciousness evolving through countless individual forms, each life a unique experiment in awareness, each challenge an opportunity for the universal to know itself more fully through particular experience. From this perspective, nothing in your life has been wasted or meaningless. Every experience, however painful or confusing, has contributed to the unique configuration of wisdom, compassion, and understanding that you represent. The mistakes you made were necessary learning opportunities. The relationships that ended taught you about love and loss. The dreams you abandoned cleared space for truer callings to emerge. Even the numbness you may have experienced served its purpose in protecting your essential nature until the conditions were right for its full expression. This recognition brings what Jung called amor fati, love of fate, acceptance of everything that has brought you to this moment of recognition. Not passive resignation, but active embrace of your entire history as necessary for your becoming. The fierce love that can look back on a life of struggle and say yes to all of it, recognizing that every twist and turn of the path has been essential for arriving at this particular quality of understanding and compassion. But wholeness is not a static state once achieved, never to be lost. It is a dynamic process of ongoing integration, a continuous dance between conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, familiar and mysterious. New aspects of self continue to emerge throughout life. New challenges call forth previously unknown capacities. New stages of development require fresh integration of competing forces. The spiral of becoming never ends. It simply grows wider and deeper with each revolution. This understanding releases you from the tyranny of spiritual perfectionism, the belief that enlightenment is a permanent state of blissful awareness, unmarked by human limitation or struggle. Instead, you discover what Jung called the ordinary enlightenment of conscious living, the ongoing practice of bringing awareness to whatever arises, accepting both light and shadow as equally sacred expressions of the totality you are. The integration process also transforms your relationship to others and to the world around you. As you become more whole within yourself, the projections that once clouded your perception begin to withdraw. You see others more clearly as separate, beings with their own valid perspectives rather than as extensions of your own psychological content. This withdrawal of projections does not create distance, but enables genuine intimacy, the ability to love and be loved for who you actually are rather than who you might imagine yourself or others to be. Your capacity for compassion deepens as you recognize in others' struggles the same fundamental challenges you have faced in your own journey toward wholeness. The judgment that once seemed necessary for maintaining your own stability gives way to understanding born of personal experience with the complexity of being human. You can hold space for others' darkness because you have learned to hold space for your own. You can offer genuine support because you know from the inside what it means to struggle with meaning, purpose, and authentic self-expression. This expansion of compassion extends beyond personal relationships to embrace your connection to the natural world and to the collective human struggle for consciousness and meaning. You begin to recognize your individual healing as inseparable from the healing of the larger systems of which you are part. Your personal integration contributes to the integration of your family, community, and species. Your individual awakening serves the awakening of consciousness itself as it evolves through countless forms toward greater wisdom, love, and creative expression. The practical implications of this recognition are profound. Your work in the world, whether paid employment or volunteer service, begins to reflect your authentic nature rather than merely meeting external expectations. Your relationships become vehicles for mutual growth and support rather than arenas for unconscious projection and manipulation. Your creative expression emerges from genuine inspiration rather than ego-driven ambition. Your spiritual practice becomes not an escape from ordinary life, but a way of sanctifying every moment with conscious attention and reverent appreciation. But perhaps most importantly, you develop what Jung called a philosophical attitude toward life, the capacity to hold your personal experience within the larger context of universal patterns and eternal questions. Your individual suffering and joy become conscious participation in the cosmic dance of becoming. Your particular challenges and gifts are recognized as unique contributions to the infinite experiment of consciousness exploring itself through form. This philosophical attitude does not minimize the reality of personal pain or make light of genuine difficulties. Instead, it provides a context large enough to hold both suffering and meaning, both limitation and transcendence, both human frailty and divine possibility. You can grieve your losses fully while recognizing them as part of the universal rhythm of attachment and letting go. You can celebrate your achievements without inflation, knowing them as temporary manifestations of eternal creativity expressing itself through your particular form. The new beginning that emerges from this integration is not a return to innocence, but an arrival at what Jung called informed naivety, the wisdom that comes full circle to embrace simplicity while carrying the depth that only experience can provide. You rediscover the wonder and spontaneity of childhood, but now supported by the hard-won understanding of maturity. You can be playful without being frivolous, serious without being grim, committed without being rigid. This new beginning manifests differently for each individual, reflecting the unique constellation of gifts, challenges, and circumstances that characterize your particular life. For some, it may involve dramatic external changes, new career, new relationships, new locations that better reflect authentic identity. For others, it may appear as subtle internal shifts that transform familiar routines and relationships from within. The specific form matters less than the underlying quality of consciousness that emerges, more integrated, more compassionate, more creatively responsive to whatever life presents. The wholeness toward which individuation moves is not perfection, but completion. The state in which nothing essential is excluded, nothing vital is rejected, nothing necessary is denied. This completion includes your strengths and weaknesses, your gifts and limitations, your successes and failures. As equally important aspects of the total configuration that you are, it is not the wholeness of having everything you want, but the wholeness of wanting everything you have, not in passive acceptance, but in active embrace of the unique experiment in consciousness that your life represents. From this place of integration, the numbness that may have initiated your journey is revealed as one of consciousness's most skillful means of self-protection and renewal. Like the winter that precedes spring, like the dark phase of the moon that precedes new light, like the dissolution that precedes creative reorganization, your emptiness created the necessary space for more authentic ways of being to emerge. What felt like death was actually gestation. What seemed like ending was actually beginning. And so the spiral turns, carrying you deeper into the mystery of what it means to be human, what it means to be conscious, what it means to participate in the endless adventure of becoming. Each revolution brings new challenges and new opportunities for integration. Each return to yourself is a return with greater wisdom, deeper compassion, and more refined capacity for love. The journey never ends, but the quality of the traveling is transformed by the recognition that you have always been whole. You are simply learning to recognize and embody the wholeness that was your birthright from the very beginning. This is the ultimate paradox of individuation. You become who you have always been. You discover what was never lost. You achieve what was already given. The return to wholeness is not the acquisition of something new, but the recognition of something eternal expressing itself through the temporary, precious, irreplaceable form of your individual existence. In embracing this paradox fully, you find not the answer to life's questions, but the capacity to live the questions themselves with grace, curiosity, and profound appreciation for the mystery of consciousness, awakening to itself through the countless unique experiments in awareness that fill the cosmos with meaning, beauty, and love.